Chapter 1 House of God, Den of Devils. The Monastery of San Benedetto. Welcome back to the Bedside Historian, where we uncover the darkest secrets of history's most twisted souls. If you're new here, subscribe now and ring that notification bell, because tonight's tale will drag you into the shadowed cloisters of medieval Italy, where holy vows became licenses for unspeakable evil, and the pursuit of purity led to the most profane acts imaginable. Tonight, we're venturing into 15th century Tuscany to tell the story of the Monastery of San Benedetto, a place that should have been a sanctuary of divine worship, but instead became a charnel house where monks violated the most sacred boundaries between life and death, between the holy and the damned. This is the story of Brother Giacomo and his fellow monks, who took their vows of chastity so literally that they preferred the cold flesh of dead nuns to the warm embrace of living women. But be warned, what you're about to hear contains accounts of necrophilia, religious blasphemy, and systematic desecration that will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval religious life. The line between sacred devotion and satanic perversion has never been more horrifyingly blurred than in the case of these monks who turned God's house into their own private morgue. So settle in for the next few hours as we explore every disturbing detail of how religious corruption can transform men of God into monsters worse than any demon that hell could produce. This is their complete story, from holy calling to unholy damnation. The morning mist that clung to the hills of Tuscany in the autumn of 1472 seemed to whisper of secrets too dark for the golden Italian sunlight to illuminate, as if the very landscape recoiled from the unspeakable acts that were about to unfold within the seemingly peaceful walls of the Monastery of San Benedetto. Perched on a hillside overlooking the fertile valleys that had nurtured Christian civilization for over 1,000 years, the monastery presented an image of serene devotion that masked appetites so depraved they would have made the devils themselves blush with shame. The Monastery of San Benedetto had been founded 3 centuries earlier by pious nobles who sought to establish a beacon of Christian virtue in the heart of Renaissance Italy. The original builders had chosen their location with care, positioning the complex on elevated ground that provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside, while maintaining the isolation necessary for contemplative religious life. The architecture itself reflected the spiritual aspirations of its founders, soaring Gothic arches that drew the eye and soul toward heaven, intricate stonework that demonstrated the devotion of craftsmen who saw their labour as prayer, and gardens designed according to the divine geometry that medieval theologians believed reflected the mind of God. But by the late 15th century, the monastery had become a refuge for a different sort of seeker, men whose religious vocations masked psychological aberrations that found expression through the corruption of everything the institution was meant to represent. The monastic community that had once attracted genuine mystics and scholars now drew individuals whose spiritual emptiness created vacuums that demonic influences rushed to fill with appetites that transgressed every boundary of human decency. Brother Giacomo di Montecroce arrived at San Benedetto on a rain-soaked evening in September 1472, carrying with him credentials that spoke of theological training at prestigious institutions and recommendations from bishops who praised his apparent devotion and scholarly expertise. His physical appearance reinforced the impression of spiritual refinement. Tall and lean, with the pale complexion that came from years of study, dark eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire, and hands that bore the ink stains of someone who had spent countless hours copying sacred texts and theological treatises. The abbot who welcomed Giacomo to the community was Dom Benedetto Corsini, a man whose own spiritual journey had been compromised by decades of political manoeuvring and financial corruption that had gradually eroded whatever genuine faith might have originally motivated his religious vocation. Corsini's administration of San Benedetto reflected the broader decay that had infected many Italian religious institutions during the Renaissance, as worldly concerns increasingly took precedence over spiritual discipline and authentic Christian practice. The monastery's proximity to the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie created opportunities for interaction between the male and female religious communities that should have been occasions for mutual spiritual support, but instead became sources of temptation that corrupted souls already weakened by years of spiritual neglect. The convent, located barely a mile from the monastery through paths that wound through olive groves and vineyards, housed nearly 60 nuns whose beauty and apparent piety had attracted donations from wealthy families throughout Tuscany. Sister Caterina Medici, a young nun whose family connections to the powerful Medici banking dynasty had secured her a position of influence within the convent despite her youth, represented everything that Giacomo found simultaneously attractive and spiritually troubling about female religious life. Her beauty was legendary throughout the region, golden hair that seemed to capture and reflect divine light, blue eyes that suggested depths of spiritual insight, and features so perfectly proportioned that artists travelled from Florence hoping to use her as a model for depictions of the Virgin Mary. But it was not merely Sister Caterina's physical beauty that captivated Giacomo's increasingly twisted imagination. It was her apparent spiritual purity that created in his mind a connection between physical perfection and divine favour that would ultimately provide the theological justification for acts that violated every principle of Christian morality. His observations of her during joint religious ceremonies convinced him that she represented a type of human being who existed on the borderline between earthly and heavenly existence, making her worthy of forms of devotion that transcended conventional moral limitations. The theological framework that Giacomo began developing during his first months at San Benedetto drew on legitimate mystical traditions, while twisting them into justifications for practices that would have horrified their original proponents. He became obsessed with concepts of spiritual purity that he interpreted through increasingly literal and physical terms, arguing that truly holy individuals possessed physical as well as spiritual characteristics that made them fundamentally different from ordinary human beings. His scholarly reputation within the monastery community provided him with access to rare theological texts and the authority to interpret complex doctrinal questions in ways that gradually influenced other members of the community who lacked his educational background. His private conversations with younger monks often focused on questions about the relationship between physical beauty and spiritual perfection, the nature of desire in religious life, and the possibility that conventional moral constraints might need to be transcended by those who had achieved higher levels of spiritual development. The daily routine of monastic life at San Benedetto had been corrupted by decades of lax discipline and compromised leadership, creating an environment where individual monks could pursue private interests without effective oversight or correction. The hours that should have been devoted to prayer, study, and manual labour were increasingly filled with activities that served personal rather than communal spiritual goals, while the accountability structures that were supposed to prevent moral corruption had been systematically undermined through political favouritism and financial considerations. Giacomo's integration into this corrupted community was facilitated by his ability to present himself as someone whose apparent devotion and scholarly expertise could enhance the monastery's reputation, while providing intellectual justification for practices that other members of the community pursued for purely selfish reasons. His theological sophistication impressed monks who had little formal education, while his apparent spirituality provided cover for individuals whose own religious commitment had been compromised by years of moral compromise. The physical layout of the monastery complex provided numerous opportunities for clandestine activities that could be conducted without observation by community members who might report suspicious behaviour to ecclesiastical authorities. The extensive crypts beneath the chapel, originally designed to house the remains of particularly holy monks, had been expanded over the centuries to include storage areas and private chambers that could be accessed through passages that were known only to long-term residents of the community. The monastery's responsibilities for maintaining the cemetery grounds of the neighbouring convent created legitimate reasons for monks to spend time in areas where they could observe the burial practices of the female religious community, while gaining intimate knowledge of the location and condition of specific graves. This cemetery work, traditionally assigned to monks who had demonstrated particular spiritual maturity and discretion, became a coveted assignment that Giacomo actively sought through political manoeuvring and demonstrations of apparent piety. The corruption that had infected San Benedetto was not unique, but reflected broader patterns of institutional decay that characterized many Italian religious communities during the late 15th century. The wealth and political influence that these institutions had accumulated over centuries of donations and land grants had created opportunities for individuals whose primary motivations were worldly rather than spiritual. While the complex relationships between religious authorities and secular power structures made effective reform extremely difficult to implement. The theological climate of Renaissance Italy, provided intellectual frameworks that could be manipulated to justify practices that would have been unthinkable in earlier periods of Christian history. The renewed interest in classical learning had introduced concepts and practices from pre-Christian traditions that some clerics attempted to synthesize with Christian doctrine in ways that opened theological doors that had previously been sealed by more rigorous doctrinal discipline. As autumn gave way to winter and Giacomo settled into the rhythms of monastic life at San Benedetto, the seeds of corruption that he carried within his soul began to germinate in the fertile soil of institutional decay and spiritual compromise that characterized the community he had joined. The monastery that had been intended as a refuge from worldly temptation was about to become the site of acts so depraved that they would shock even the jaded observers of Renaissance Italian religious life. The house of God was preparing to become a den of devils, and the monks who should have been guardians of Christian virtue were about to reveal themselves as predators whose appetites transcended every boundary that separated the sacred from the profane, the living from the dead, and the holy from the damned. The stage was set for a descent into evil that would test the limits of human depravity, while challenging every assumption about the relationship between religious vocation and moral character. Brother Giacomo had found his calling, but it was not the calling of God that had brought him to San Benedetto. It was the call of forces far darker and more ancient than anything that holy orders were designed to contain or channel toward righteous purposes. Chapter 2, Sacred Flesh, Profane Hunger, The Corruption Begins. The theological library of San Benedetto became Brother Giacomo's laboratory for developing the intellectual justifications that would transform his psychological aberrations into what he convinced himself was a higher form of spiritual devotion. Surrounded by centuries of accumulated Christian wisdom, he systematically perverted the teachings of saints and mystics, creating a blasphemous theology that would provide the foundation for acts that violated every principle of human decency, while claiming divine sanction for unspeakable evil. His scholarly research during the winter months of 1472 focused obsessively on concepts of purity, perfection, and the relationship between physical beauty and spiritual holiness. The theological texts that had been collected by generations of devout monks became source material for arguments that would have horrified their original authors, as Giacomo cherry-picked quotations and twisted interpretations to support conclusions that inverted the fundamental values of Christian civilization. The doctrine that emerged from these twisted studies held that truly pure souls inhabited bodies that reflected their spiritual perfection through physical beauty, making such individuals fundamentally different from ordinary human beings whose moral corruption was reflected in their physical imperfections. According to Giacomo's perverted logic, the most beautiful nuns represented a form of humanity that was closer to angelic nature than to normal mortal existence, making them worthy of forms of veneration that transcended conventional moral limitations. But the most insidious aspect of Giacomo's developing theology was his argument that physical death actually enhanced, rather than diminished, the spiritual purity of holy individuals by removing their souls from the contaminating influence of worldly existence, while preserving their physical forms in states of perfect preservation that reflected their divine favour. This reasoning led him to conclude that the corpses of particularly beautiful and holy nuns represented the ultimate synthesis of spiritual perfection and physical beauty, making them more worthy of devotion than any living woman could ever be. The corruption of other members of the monastic community began gradually, as Giacomo identified individuals whose own spiritual weaknesses made them susceptible to his twisted teachings. Brother Lorenzo da Pisa, a young monk whose theological education had been rudimentary, and whose personality showed signs of the psychological instability that had driven him to seek refuge in religious life, became Giacomo's first convert to what would eventually become a cult of necrophilic worship that corrupted everyone it touched. Lorenzo's attraction to Giacomo's teachings reflected his own struggles with desires that he found impossible to reconcile with his religious vows. The traditional Christian approach to managing sexual temptation through prayer, penance, and spiritual discipline had proven inadequate for someone whose psychological makeup included compulsions that conventional moral frameworks could not address. Giacomo's alternative theology offered what seemed like a solution that could satisfy these urges while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion. The process by which Giacomo corrupted Lorenzo involved months of careful psychological manipulation that began with theological discussions and gradually progressed toward more explicit explorations of the relationship between physical desire and spiritual devotion. The library sessions that initially focused on legitimate questions about mystical theology evolved into conversations about the nature of beauty, the meaning of purity, and the possibility that conventional moral constraints might not apply to individuals who had achieved higher levels of spiritual development. Brother Antonio Vespucci, whose family connections to the famous Florentine navigator provided him with social standing within the monastic community, despite his obvious moral deficiencies, represented a different type of corruption that Giacomo learned to exploit for his own purposes. Antonio's religious vocation had been motivated primarily by family pressure and financial considerations, rather than genuine spiritual calling, making him susceptible to arguments that could justify the pursuit of personal pleasure while maintaining the external appearances of religious observance. The corruption of Antonio required different techniques than those that had proven effective with Lorenzo, as his cynical attitude toward religious life made him immune to purely theological arguments, while his worldly sophistication required more subtle forms of persuasion. Giacomo approached him through appeals to intellectual curiosity and social rebellion, presenting his perverted practices as forms of aristocratic privilege that transcended the moral limitations imposed on ordinary believers. The development of their secret brotherhood proceeded according to patterns that reflected Giacomo's understanding of group psychology and organizational dynamics. The three men began meeting in private locations within the monastery complex, initially for theological discussions that gradually evolved into more explicit planning sessions for activities that would have resulted in their immediate expulsion and probable execution if discovered by legitimate church authorities. The theological framework that governed their secret meetings drew on genuine mystical traditions while inverting their essential meanings in ways that transformed practices designed to promote spiritual development into justifications for the most depraved forms of self-indulgence. Their version of contemplative prayer involved meditations on the physical beauty of specific nuns, while their scriptural studies focused on passages that could be interpreted as supporting their claims about the special nature of physically perfect individuals. The practical preparations for their eventual acts of necrophilia began with reconnaissance activities that were disguised as legitimate religious duties. Giacomo's growing reputation as a scholar provided him with opportunities to visit the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie for consultations about theological questions, allowing him to observe the daily routines of the nuns while identifying individuals whose beauty and apparent holiness made them suitable targets for future violations. These observation sessions were conducted with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that successful criminal enterprise required careful planning and systematic preparation. Giacomo compiled detailed notes about the health, habits, and social relationships of specific nuns, while paying particular attention to factors that might affect their likelihood of dying natural deaths that could provide opportunities for the activities he was planning. The psychological dynamics that developed within the group reflected the different personality types and motivations that had brought each member to embrace Giacomo's perverted theology. Lorenzo's participation was driven by genuine belief in the theological justifications that Giacomo provided, making him an enthusiastic advocate for practices that he convinced himself were forms of divine worship rather than criminal violations of human decency. Antonio's involvement reflected more cynical motivations that had less to do with theological conviction than with the thrill of transgressing social boundaries while maintaining the appearance of respectability. His aristocratic background had provided him with a sense of entitlement that made him susceptible to arguments about special privileges that were available to individuals of superior social and intellectual standing. Giacomo himself occupied the position of intellectual leader and chief theorist for practices that he had originally developed as solutions to his own psychological problems, but had gradually evolved into a comprehensive worldview that could justify virtually any form of behavior that served his personal desires. His role as the group's theological authority provided him with power over the other members that he exercised through a combination of intellectual manipulation and implied threats about the consequences of betraying their shared secrets. The evolution of their activities from theoretical discussions to practical preparations required the development of specialized knowledge and resources that went far beyond the normal requirements of monastic life. They needed to learn about burial practices, preservation techniques, and the physical changes that occurred in human bodies after death, while acquiring tools and materials that could be used for exhuming corpses and preparing them for their intended violations. The acquisition of this knowledge required contacts with individuals whose own activities operated outside the boundaries of legitimate society. The monastery's location in the heart of Tuscany provided access to networks of grave robbers, body snatchers, and practitioners of various forms of folk magic who possessed the practical expertise that the monks needed for their planned activities. The financing of their preparations required access to monetary resources that exceeded what individual monks could normally command through their religious positions. This challenge was solved through a combination of creative accounting practices that diverted monastery funds toward their private activities and relationships with external patrons who were willing to provide financial support in exchange for various forms of consideration that compromised the community's spiritual integrity. The physical modifications that were made to areas within the monastery complex reflected the increasing sophistication of their planning as their theoretical discussions evolved toward practical implementation. The crypts beneath the chapel were expanded and modified to include chambers that could serve as preparation areas and storage facilities, while access routes were developed that would allow them to transport materials and conduct activities without observation by other members of the monastic community. As the winter of 1472 gave way to spring, the three monks had completed the intellectual, practical, and logistical preparations that would allow them to begin the systematic violation of everything their religious vows were supposed to protect and preserve. The sacred flesh that should have been objects of reverent protection was about to become the focus of profane hunger that would transform men of God into predators whose appetites exceeded anything that hell itself could have conceived. The corruption was complete, the justifications were in place, and the stage was set for acts that would redefine the very concept of blasphemy, while demonstrating the depths of evil that could emerge when religious authority was wielded by individuals whose souls had been claimed by forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. The sacred had become profane, and the profane was about to become systematically predatory in ways that would shock even the most jaded observers of Renaissance Italian religious corruption. Brother Giacomo and his disciples were ready to begin their harvest of the dead, and the beautiful nuns of Santa Maria delle Grazie had no idea that their greatest danger would come not from worldly temptations, but from the very men who were supposed to be their spiritual guardians and protectors. Chapter 3. The Gardener of Death, Keeper of the Cemetery. The appointment of Brother Giacomo as the official keeper of the Santa Maria delle Grazie cemetery came through a combination of political manoeuvring and carefully orchestrated demonstrations of piety that convinced the convent's leadership he was the ideal candidate for such a sacred responsibility. The position, which had traditionally been held by the most spiritually mature monks who could be trusted with the solemn duty of tending to the eternal rest of deceased sisters, became the key that would unlock opportunities for systematic desecration that exceeded the most depraved fantasies of his corrupted imagination. The cemetery itself was a testament to centuries of devotion and sacrifice by generations of nuns who had dedicated their lives to the service of God and the care of the local community. Located on a hillside that caught the first rays of dawn and the last light of sunset, the grounds had been carefully designed to provide a peaceful final resting place for women whose earthly lives had been spent in prayer, charity, and the pursuit of spiritual perfection. Ancient olive trees provided shade for the carefully maintained graves, while stone pathways wound between burial plots that were marked by simple crosses bearing the names and dates that summarized entire lifetimes of devotion. Giacomo's first weeks in his new position were spent learning the routines and responsibilities that came with maintaining such sacred ground. The physical demands of the work, digging graves, maintaining landscaping, and ensuring that burial sites remained properly consecrated, provided legitimate cover for activities that allowed him to spend hours studying the layout of the cemetery while developing detailed knowledge of burial practices that would prove essential for his future violations. The convent's burial traditions reflected the spiritual values that had guided the community for generations, emphasizing simplicity, humility, and equality in death that mirrored the egalitarian principles that governed their communal life. Nuns were buried in simple wooden coffins that were crafted by local artisans, according to specifications that prioritized dignity over ostentation, while burial ceremonies focused on prayers for the deceased rather than elaborate displays of worldly grief or commemoration. But it was precisely this simplicity that made the cemetery so vulnerable to the kind of systematic exploitation that Giacomo was planning. The wooden coffins that were designed to return their occupants to the earth through natural decomposition could be easily accessed by someone with the proper tools and knowledge, while the isolated location of many burial sites provided opportunities for clandestine activities that could be conducted without observation by community members who might report suspicious behavior. Giacomo's daily observations of burial ceremonies provided him with intelligence that was crucial for planning future violations. He learned to evaluate the physical condition and apparent preservation state of deceased nuns, noting factors such as age at death, cause of mortality, and length of illness that might affect the condition of their remains weeks or months after burial. This information was carefully recorded in private journals that he disguised as routine cemetery maintenance records. The most significant development during his early months as cemetery keeper was his growing obsession with Sister Caterina Medici, whose beauty and apparent holiness had made her the focus of fantasies that became increasingly elaborate and specific as he gained access to information about her daily routines and personal characteristics. His position provided him with opportunities to observe her during burial ceremonies for other nuns, allowing him to study her reactions to death and her apparent understanding of the spiritual significance of mortality. Sister Caterina's approach to death and burial reflected a theological sophistication that impressed even Giacomo's corrupted intellect, as she demonstrated understanding of complex doctrinal questions about the relationship between physical death and spiritual transition that went far beyond what might be expected from someone of her age and limited formal education. Her conversations with other nuns about the nature of eternal life revealed depths of spiritual insight that convinced Giacomo she represented the kind of perfect synthesis between physical beauty and spiritual development that his perverted theology proclaimed as the highest form of human existence. The practical preparations that Giacomo made during his first months as cemetery keeper involved the systematic identification and preparation of locations that could serve as temporary storage and preparation sites for exhumed corpses. The cemetery's layout included several maintenance buildings that had been constructed over the centuries to house tools and materials needed for groundskeeping, and these structures could be modified to serve purposes that were far removed from their original intentions. The most important of these modifications involved the expansion of underground storage areas that had originally been designed to hold seasonal equipment and supplies. These chambers were enlarged and fitted with the kind of drainage and ventilation systems that would be necessary for activities involving human remains, while access routes were developed that would allow materials to be moved without observation from the convent buildings or public pathways. The acquisition of specialized tools and materials required for grave robbing and corpse preparation presented challenges that Giacomo solved through relationships with individuals whose own activities operated outside the boundaries of legitimate society. The monastery's location in rural Tuscany provided access to networks of smugglers, grave robbers, and practitioners of various forms of black market commerce who could provide equipment that would have been impossible to obtain through normal channels. The most crucial relationships that Giacomo developed during this period were with professional grave robbers who possessed the technical expertise needed for efficient exhumation, while minimizing the risk of detection by authorities or community members. These individuals, who typically operated under cover of darkness and maintained strict codes of secrecy about their activities, were initially suspicious of a monk who claimed to need their services for legitimate religious purposes. The negotiations that eventually led to ongoing collaboration between Giacomo and these criminal networks required the development of cover stories that could explain why a cemetery keeper might need assistance with activities that went beyond normal maintenance responsibilities. Giacomo's scholarly reputation and apparent theological expertise provided credibility for claims that he was conducting research into burial practices and preservation techniques that required access to recently interred remains. The financial arrangements that supported these collaborations required access to monetary resources that exceeded what individual monks could normally command through their religious positions. This challenge was solved through systematic embezzlement of monastery funds that were officially designated for cemetery maintenance and improvements, while additional resources were obtained through relationships with wealthy patrons who were convinced that their donations were supporting legitimate scholarly research. The development of specialized knowledge about human anatomy, decomposition processes, and preservation techniques required study that went far beyond anything that normal religious education would have provided. Giacomo spent months researching medical texts and consulting with physicians who possessed the kind of detailed understanding of human physiology that would be necessary for the activities he was planning. The most disturbing aspect of these educational efforts was Giacomo's growing expertise in techniques for preserving human remains in conditions that would maintain their physical beauty while preventing the natural decomposition processes that would have made his intended violations impossible to accomplish. This knowledge, which combined legitimate medical understanding with practices that bordered on necromancy, allowed him to develop procedures that could maintain corpses in states that served his perverted purposes. The psychological transformation that Giacomo underwent during his months as cemetery keeper reflected the gradual corruption of whatever genuine religious sentiment might have originally motivated his monastic vocation. His daily contact with death and burial created a familiarity with mortality that desensitized him to the natural human revulsion toward corpses, while reinforcing his twisted beliefs about the special nature of beautiful deceased women. The theological framework that guided his activities continued to evolve as he gained practical experience with the realities of death and burial. His perverted doctrine increasingly emphasized the superiority of deceased beauty over living flesh, arguing that death perfected rather than corrupted the physical forms of truly holy individuals while removing them from the contaminating influences of worldly existence. The influence that Giacomo's position gave him over burial practices within the convent community created opportunities for subtle manipulations that served his long-term planning while maintaining the appearance of appropriate religious devotion. His recommendations about burial locations, coffin construction, and ceremonial procedures were accepted without question by convent leadership, who trusted his apparent expertise and spiritual commitment. The most sinister aspect of these manipulations involved his growing influence over medical care provided to elderly and infirm nuns, whose deaths could provide opportunities for the activities he was planning. His theological counseling of dying sisters included suggestions about spiritual preparation that actually served to gather intelligence about their physical condition and expected survival times, while his participation in last rites ceremonies provided access to information that could be used for targeting specific individuals. As the autumn of 1473 approached, Brother Giacomo had established himself as an indispensable part of the religious community that surrounded the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, while systematically preparing for acts that would violate every principle that the community was supposed to represent. His position as cemetery keeper had provided him with the access, knowledge, and resources needed to begin the systematic harvest of innocent flesh, while his reputation for holiness had placed him above suspicion from authorities who should have been protecting the very victims he was preparing to exploit. The gardener of death had tended his plot with meticulous care, and soon it would be time to begin reaping the harvest that would satisfy appetites too depraved for the living world to accommodate. Sister Caterina and her fellow nuns continued their daily routines of prayer and service, unaware that their greatest danger came not from worldly temptations, but from the man they trusted to guard their eternal rest and ensure their peaceful transition from earthly life to heavenly reward. The stage was set for violations that would transform sacred ground into a charnel house of unspeakable evil, and the keeper of the cemetery was ready to become the harvester of the dead, in service to appetites that hell itself would have found difficult to accommodate or approve. Chapter 4. When Angels Fall, the Death of Sister Caterina. The illness that would claim Sister Caterina's life began as a subtle weakness that she attributed to the spiritual disciplines of extended fasting and nighttime prayer vigils, but which those with more worldly knowledge recognized as symptoms of systematic poisoning that had been carefully calibrated to produce a gradual decline rather than sudden death that might trigger unwanted medical investigation. Brother Giacomo's months of preparation had included the acquisition of specialized knowledge about toxins and their effects on the human body, allowing him to orchestrate the demise of his primary target while maintaining plausible deniability about the supernatural timing of her departure from the mortal world. The poison that Giacomo employed for this ultimate act of premeditated murder was a sophisticated blend of natural substances that had been used for centuries by assassins and poisoners who needed to eliminate targets without leaving obvious evidence of foul play. The primary component was extracted from deadly nightshade that grew wild in the forests surrounding the monastery, while secondary ingredients included compounds derived from various fungi and mineral substances that enhanced the toxic effects while masking their presence through symptoms that resembled common illnesses. The delivery method that Giacomo developed for administering these lethal substances took advantage of his legitimate access to the convent as cemetery keeper and theological consultant. His regular visits to provide spiritual guidance and assist with religious ceremonies created opportunities to contaminate food, water, and even religious objects that Sister Caterina would handle during her daily devotions. The gradual nature of the poisoning process meant that weeks passed between initial exposure and final death, creating a timeline that seemed natural to observers who had no reason to suspect deliberate murder. Sister Caterina's response to her mysterious illness reflected the spiritual maturity and theological sophistication that had made her such an object of fascination for Giacomo's corrupted imagination. Rather than complaining about her physical suffering or seeking medical attention that might have identified the true cause of her condition, she interpreted her declining health as a divine test that required acceptance with grace and continued dedication to her religious duties despite increasing weakness and pain. Her approach to dying became a source of edification for the entire convent community, as she used her remaining strength to provide spiritual guidance to other nuns while maintaining the prayer schedules and devotional practices that had characterized her religious life since taking her vows years earlier. The example of faithful endurance that she provided during her final weeks reinforced her reputation for holiness, while making her eventual death seem like the natural conclusion of a life that had been entirely devoted to divine service. The medical attention that Sister Caterina received during her illness was provided by physicians whose knowledge of toxicology was insufficient to identify the sophisticated poisoning that was gradually destroying her vital organs. The symptoms that she exhibited, progressive weakness, digestive disturbances, and neurological deterioration, were consistent with various natural diseases that commonly affected individuals living in religious communities where sanitation and nutrition were often compromised by the material limitations of monastic life. Brother Giacomo's visits to provide spiritual comfort during Sister Caterina's final illness served the dual purpose of monitoring the progress of his poisoning while gathering intelligence about her expected survival time and the likely scheduling of burial ceremonies. His apparent concern for her spiritual welfare impressed both the dying nun and the community members who observed his dedicated attention to her needs during this difficult period. The theological discussions that Giacomo conducted with Sister Caterina during her final weeks revealed depths of spiritual insight that convinced him his assessment of her exceptional nature had been correct. Her understanding of complex doctrinal questions about death, resurrection, and eternal life demonstrated intellectual sophistication that went far beyond what formal education could have provided, while her personal holiness seemed to illuminate her physical beauty with qualities that made her appear more angelic than human. But the most disturbing aspect of these deathbed conversations was the way that Sister Caterina's increasing weakness and approaching death seemed to enhance rather than diminish her physical attractiveness in Giacomo's perverted perception. Her pale complexion took on a translucent quality that made her seem ethereal, while the spiritual serenity that characterized her approach to mortality created an appearance of perfect peace that convinced him death would preserve her beauty in the ideal state that his twisted theology proclaimed as the ultimate expression of divine perfection. The final days of Sister Caterina's life were marked by supernatural phenomena that convinced even skeptical observers that they were witnessing the death of someone whose spiritual development had transcended normal human limitations. Her prayers during the final hours seemed to create atmospheric changes in her cell, while witnesses reported seeing apparitions and experiencing spiritual manifestations that suggested the presence of otherworldly beings who had come to escort her soul to its eternal reward. The moment of her death, which occurred just before dawn on November 15, 1473, was witnessed by several nuns who later testified that Sister Caterina's final breath was accompanied by light phenomena and celestial sounds that confirmed her transition from earthly existence to heavenly glory. Her face at the moment of death took on an expression of such perfect peace and beauty that observers were convinced they were seeing a preview of the resurrection body that she would inhabit throughout eternity. Brother Giacomo's presence at Sister Caterina's deathbed allowed him to observe the immediate post-mortem changes that would affect the condition of her remains and determine the optimal timing for his planned violation. His apparent grief and spiritual anguish at losing such a holy member of the religious community impressed observers who had no reason to suspect that his emotions were motivated by anticipation rather than sorrow. The preparation of Sister Caterina's body for burial followed traditional practices that had been established over centuries of convent life, emphasizing dignity and simplicity, while ensuring that her physical remains would be treated with the reverence appropriate for someone whose spiritual development had been so exemplary. The nuns who performed these final services were unaware that their careful attention to preserving her beauty was actually facilitating the violations that would follow once she had been interred in the consecrated ground that was supposed to protect her eternal rest. The funeral ceremony that honoured Sister Caterina's life and mourned her death attracted participants from throughout the local religious community, as news of her holy death had spread quickly among individuals who recognised the spiritual significance of witnessing the transition of someone whose earthly life had been so completely devoted to divine service. The elaborate prayers and ceremonial observances that marked her burial created an atmosphere of sacred celebration that masked the profane anticipation that motivated Brother Giacomo's participation in the proceedings. The burial itself took place in a location that Giacomo had carefully selected, based on its accessibility for future clandestine activities, and its distance from areas where suspicious sounds or activities might be observed by community members. The gravesite, positioned beneath an ancient olive tree that provided natural concealment while maintaining the appearance of appropriate dignity, would become the epicenter for violations that transformed sacred ground into a theatre for unspeakable evil. The immediate aftermath of Sister Caterina's burial created a period of communal mourning that provided perfect cover for the final preparations that would be necessary before Giacomo could begin the systematic violation of her remains. The heightened spiritual atmosphere that characterized the convent during this period of grief made community members less likely to notice unusual activities or investigate suspicious sounds that might indicate unauthorized disturbances of the cemetery grounds. The psychological impact of Sister Caterina's death on Brother Giacomo revealed the complete corruption of whatever human empathy might have once existed within his soul. Rather than experiencing genuine grief at the loss of someone whose spiritual beauty had inspired his initial fascination, he felt only satisfaction at having successfully orchestrated the demise of his primary target while maintaining the appearance of innocent spiritual guidance throughout her final illness. The planning sessions that Giacomo conducted with brothers Lorenzo and Antonio during the days following the burial focused on the technical and logistical requirements for their first act of systematic necrophilia. The months of theoretical preparation and resource acquisition had led to this moment when their perverted theology would be translated into physical acts that would violate every boundary between the sacred and the profane. The tools and materials that had been assembled for the exhumation were hidden in locations throughout the cemetery that provided easy access while maintaining concealment from potential observers. The specialized knowledge that had been acquired about preservation techniques and anatomical manipulation would soon be applied to transform Sister Caterina's consecrated remains into objects that served appetites too depraved for normal human comprehension. As the first week after the burial drew to a close and the initial intensity of communal mourning began to subside, Brother Giacomo prepared to cross the final threshold that would transform him from corrupted monk into necrophilic predator. The angel had fallen into his carefully prepared trap, and soon her earthly beauty would serve purposes that inverted every principle of the Christian civilization that had shaped the community where she had lived, died, and been laid to rest. The death of Sister Caterina marked the end of innocence for the entire religious community that had nurtured her spiritual development, though they would not discover the true significance of their loss until much later, when the full scope of the violations would be revealed. For now they mourned the passing of someone they believed had achieved the kind of spiritual perfection that offered hope and inspiration for their own religious journeys, unaware that her death had been orchestrated by the very person they trusted to guard her eternal rest. The stage was set for acts that would redefine the very concept of blasphemy while demonstrating that evil could corrupt even the most sacred institutions when it found willing servants among those who had been entrusted with protecting everything pure and holy in human existence. Sister Caterina's journey from life to death was complete, but her suffering was only beginning as she became the first victim in a campaign of necrophilic horror that would claim dozens of innocent souls before justice finally intervened to stop the monsters who had made themselves the enemies of everything decent and sacred in the mortal world. Chapter 5. Disciples of Darkness, Corrupting Others. The recruitment of additional participants into Brother Giacomo's circle of necrophilic devotees required sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that exploited the spiritual vulnerabilities and personal weaknesses that had driven various monks to seek refuge in religious life rather than confront the moral challenges of secular existence. The expansion of their blasphemous brotherhood from 3 core members to a network that eventually included nearly a dozen participants demonstrated Giacomo's understanding of group dynamics and his ability to identify individuals whose character deficiencies made them susceptible to corruption through carefully orchestrated processes of moral degradation. Brother Francesco di Arezzo became the 4th member of their unholy fellowship through a process of gradual seduction that began with theological discussions about the nature of spiritual purity and evolved into participation in acts that violated every principle of Christian morality while claiming divine sanction for practices that would have horrified any genuine believer. Francesco's psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for recruitment. His religious vocation had been motivated primarily by family pressure rather than authentic spiritual calling, while his personality showed signs of the moral weakness and intellectual vanity that Giacomo had learned to exploit in previous conversions. The corruption process that transformed Francesco from reluctant monastery resident into enthusiastic participant in systematic necrophilia followed patterns that Giacomo had refined through his experiences with Lorenzo and Antonio. The initial phase involved private conversations about complex theological questions that gradually introduced concepts about the special nature of physical beauty and its relationship to spiritual perfection, while carefully avoiding explicit discussions of the practical activities that these theoretical frameworks were designed to justify. The second phase of Francesco's corruption involved exposure to carefully selected texts and images that reinforced the theological arguments while providing visual stimulation that awakened desires that conventional religious discipline had been unable to eliminate or redirect toward appropriate spiritual channels. These materials, which Giacomo had acquired through his connections with various black market networks, included illustrations of female religious figures that emphasized their physical beauty while maintaining the appearance of legitimate devotional art. The final phase of Francesco's recruitment required direct participation in preparatory activities that gradually accustomed him to handling human remains, while desensitizing him to the natural revulsion that normal individuals experience when confronted with death and decomposition. These exercises began with assistance in legitimate cemetery maintenance duties, but evolved into increasingly explicit involvement with exhumed corpses that served as training materials for the violations that would follow. Brother Matteo da Siena represented a different type of personality that required alternative recruitment strategies based on appeals to intellectual curiosity and social rebellion rather than theological conviction. His background as a former university student who had been forced into religious life following a scandal involving debts and inappropriate relationships with women made him susceptible to arguments that presented their activities as forms of sophisticated transgression that transcended the moral limitations imposed on ordinary believers. The corruption of Matteo proceeded more rapidly than had been the case with previous recruits, as his cynical attitude toward religious life made him less resistant to explicit descriptions of their intended activities, while his worldly experience provided him with knowledge about sexual practices that could be adapted to serve their necrophilic purposes. His recruitment was completed within weeks, rather than the months that had been required for individuals whose religious convictions created psychological barriers that needed to be systematically dismantled. The organizational structure that emerged as their brotherhood expanded reflected Giacomo's understanding of criminal enterprise and his ability to create hierarchies that maximized operational efficiency while minimizing the risk of discovery by individuals who might report their activities to legitimate authorities. The group was divided into specialized roles that included theological justification, practical implementation, resource acquisition, and security maintenance, with each member contributing skills that enhance their collective capabilities. Brother Giacomo maintained his position as supreme leader and chief theologian, providing the intellectual frameworks that justified their activities while making final decisions about targeting, timing, and methodology. His scholarly reputation and apparent spiritual authority gave him influence over other members that he exercised through a combination of theological instruction and implied threats about the consequences of betraying their shared secrets. Brothers Lorenzo and Antonio occupied positions as senior disciples who were responsible for training new recruits and overseeing the practical implementation of activities that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Their experience with previous violations provided them with expertise that was essential for maintaining the operational standards that Giacomo demanded while ensuring that their criminal activities could be conducted without detection. The newer recruits were assigned supporting roles that involved resource acquisition, surveillance, and security maintenance, while being gradually introduced to more direct participation in violations as they demonstrated reliability and commitment to the group's perverted objectives. This hierarchical structure created psychological pressures that reinforced group cohesion while making individual defection increasingly difficult as members became more deeply implicated in collective criminal activities. The training programs that were developed for new recruits combined theological instruction with practical exercises that systematically destroyed whatever moral constraints might have prevented complete participation in their necrophilic activities. The religious education component focused on the theological arguments that Giacomo had developed to justify their practices, while the practical training involved increasingly explicit exposure to human remains and participation in preparatory activities that desensitized participants to the physical and psychological challenges of systematic corpse violation. The most disturbing aspect of these training programs was their effectiveness in transforming individuals who had entered religious life with at least some genuine spiritual aspirations into enthusiastic participants in acts that represented the complete inversion of Christian values. The psychological techniques that Giacomo employed drew on legitimate religious traditions of spiritual formation, while perverting their essential purposes in ways that produced moral corruption rather than spiritual development. The resource acquisition activities that supported their expanding operations required increasingly sophisticated networks of criminal contacts and financial arrangements that reflected the growing scale and complexity of their systematic necrophilia. The costs associated with bribing officials, acquiring specialized equipment, and maintaining secret facilities had grown beyond what could be supported through simple embezzlement of monastery funds, requiring the development of alternative income sources that further compromised their religious integrity. The most lucrative of these alternative income sources involved the sale of religious artifacts and services to wealthy patrons who were willing to pay premium prices for access to supposedly holy objects and spiritual guidance that could provide supernatural assistance with personal or business problems. These arrangements, which generated substantial revenues while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious commerce, allowed the group to finance increasingly elaborate operations while expanding their influence within the broader religious community. The security measures that were implemented to protect their activities from discovery by legitimate authorities reflected Giacomo's understanding of investigative techniques and his ability to anticipate potential threats to their operational security. The group developed elaborate protocols for communications, meetings, and activity coordination that minimized the risk of creating evidence that could be used against them if their activities were eventually discovered and investigated. The most important of these security measures involved the systematic corruption of officials whose positions gave them oversight responsibility for religious institutions and cemetery operations. Through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and theological manipulation, they created networks of protection that shielded their activities from official scrutiny, while providing early warning about potential investigations that might threaten their continued operations. The psychological dynamics that developed within the group as their membership expanded revealed patterns of collective moral degradation that exceeded what any individual member might have achieved through solitary corruption. The group environment created peer pressure effects that encouraged increasingly extreme violations, while providing social reinforcement for activities that would have been psychologically difficult to sustain without the support and validation of like-minded participants. The theological discussions that continued to characterize their regular meetings served the dual purpose of reinforcing their intellectual justifications while planning future activities that would test the limits of their collective depravity. These sessions, which combined elements of religious instruction with criminal conspiracy, created a unique form of blasphemous worship that inverted traditional spiritual practices while serving the practical needs of systematic corpse violation. The expansion of their target selection criteria reflected their growing confidence and operational capabilities as they began identifying potential victims among living nuns whose deaths could be orchestrated to provide fresh corpses that met their increasingly sophisticated standards for beauty and spiritual purity. This transition from opportunistic exploitation of natural deaths to premeditated murder marked a crucial escalation in their criminal activities that would eventually lead to their discovery and prosecution. As the Brotherhood entered its second year of operations, Brother Giacomo had successfully created an organization that combined religious authority with criminal expertise to produce the most systematic campaign of necrophilic violation in recorded history. The disciples of darkness had been recruited, trained, and deployed in service to appetites that challenged every assumption about the relationship between religious vocation and moral character. The corruption was complete, the organization was operational, and the stage was set for an escalation of activities that would transform their relatively modest beginnings into an industrial-scale harvest of innocent flesh that would eventually claim dozens of victims while shocking even the most jaded observers of Renaissance Italian religious corruption. The disciples had learned their lessons well, and soon they would be ready to demonstrate the full extent of their commitment to serving forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. Chapter 6. The Night Harvest. Systematic Desecration. The first systematic exhumation of Sister Caterina's remains took place on a moonless November night, exactly 2 weeks after her burial, when atmospheric conditions and community routines provided optimal concealment for activities that would transform consecrated ground into a theatre for violations that exceeded the most depraved fantasies of their corrupted imaginations. Brother Giacomo and his disciples approached their unholy work with the methodical precision of craftsmen who had spent months preparing for this moment when their perverted theology would be translated into physical acts that challenged every assumption about the relationship between death and human dignity. The tools that had been assembled for this inaugural violation represented the culmination of months of planning and resource acquisition that had required connections with criminal networks throughout central Italy. The specialized excavation equipment included not just conventional grave-digging implements, but sophisticated devices designed for rapid and efficient exhumation, while minimizing evidence that might indicate unauthorized disturbance of burial sites. Additional tools served purposes that reflected their intended violations: restraining devices, preservation materials, and instruments whose functions were too obscene to describe in detail. The exhumation process itself was conducted according to protocols that Giacomo had developed through consultation with professional grave robbers and study of medical texts that describe techniques for handling human remains. The wooden coffin that had been designed to facilitate natural decomposition could be accessed relatively easily, but the condition of Sister Caterina's body after 2 weeks in the ground required careful evaluation to determine whether preservation was adequate for their intended purposes. The moment when Sister Caterina's corpse was first exposed to their perverted gaze marked a psychological threshold that completed the transformation of men who had once taken vows to serve God into creatures whose appetites transcended every boundary of human decency. Her physical beauty, which had been enhanced rather than diminished by the early stages of decomposition, convinced them that their theological theories about death perfecting rather than corrupting spiritual purity had been vindicated through empirical observation. The initial violation that followed her exhumation was conducted according to ritualistic procedures that combined elements of religious ceremony with practices that inverted every principle of Christian worship. The participants surrounded her remains in formations that replicated traditional liturgical arrangements, while reciting prayers that had been composed specifically for these occasions, creating blasphemous worship services that used the vocabulary of holiness to justify acts of absolute evil. Brother Giacomo's role as primary violator reflected his position as theological leader and chief architect of their systematic necrophilia, but the participation of other members in supporting roles ensured that every individual present became directly complicit in crimes that would bind them together through shared guilt, while making individual betrayal psychologically and practically impossible. The rotating assignments that characterize subsequent violations served to distribute responsibility while providing each participant with opportunities to serve as primary violator. The preservation techniques that were employed to maintain Sister Caterina's corpse in conditions suitable for repeated violations represented a synthesis of legitimate medical knowledge with practices that bordered on necromancy. The procedures involved careful manipulation of decomposition processes through chemical treatments and environmental controls that could extend the usability of remains far beyond what natural preservation would have allowed. The storage facilities that had been prepared in the expanded crypts beneath the monastery chapel provided controlled environments where exhumed corpses could be maintained while serving the ongoing needs of their systematic violations. These chambers, which had been modified with ventilation systems and drainage facilities, could accommodate multiple bodies simultaneously while maintaining the secrecy that was essential for their continued operations. The psychological impact of their first successful violation exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, as the experience validated their theological justifications while providing satisfaction that convinced them their activities represented the highest form of spiritual devotion rather than criminal corruption. The combination of physical gratification with religious conviction created addictive psychological patterns that made escalation of their activities virtually inevitable. The logistical challenges associated with returning Sister Caterina's remains to her grave after their initial violation required procedures that could restore the appearance of undisturbed burial while accommodating the physical changes that had resulted from their activities. The techniques that were developed for this purpose allowed them to conduct repeated violations over extended periods, while maintaining the illusion that consecrated ground remained inviolate. The success of their inaugural violation led to immediate planning for additional activities that would expand their operations to include other recently deceased nuns whose beauty and apparent spiritual purity made them suitable targets for similar treatment. The selection criteria that had been developed during their months of preparation were applied to identify potential victims whose deaths could be exploited through systematic exhumation and violation. Sister Margherita di Prato, whose death from fever had occurred within days of Sister Caterina's burial, became their second victim through processes that replicated the techniques that had proven successful in their initial operation. Her exhumation was conducted with greater efficiency and confidence, as the participants had overcome whatever residual psychological barriers might have prevented complete commitment to their necrophilic activities. The expansion of their operations to include multiple simultaneous victims required organizational innovations that reflected their growing expertise and operational sophistication. The underground facilities were expanded to accommodate additional corpses, while the rotation schedules that governed individual participation were modified to ensure that every member of their brotherhood had regular opportunities for direct involvement in violations. The recruitment of additional participants continued throughout this period of operational expansion, as their success in conducting systematic violations without detection convinced potential converts that their activities enjoyed supernatural protection that placed them beyond the reach of earthly authorities. The theological arguments that had proven effective in previous recruitment efforts were refined and standardized, creating systematic indoctrination procedures that could efficiently transform potential recruits into committed participants. Brother Salvatore de Luca represented a particularly valuable addition to their brotherhood, as his background in medical studies provided expertise that enhanced their preservation techniques, while his knowledge of anatomy allowed for more sophisticated forms of corpse manipulation. His recruitment required different approaches than had proven effective with previous converts, as his scientific training made him less susceptible to purely theological arguments, while his practical experience with human remains reduced the effectiveness of gradual desensitization techniques. The corruption of Salvatore proceeded through appeals to intellectual curiosity and scientific inquiry, as Giacomo presented their activities as forms of empirical research that could advance understanding of human physiology and spiritual development through direct observation of post-mortem phenomena. This approach proved successful in overcoming Salvatore's initial resistance, while providing him with rationalizations that allowed full participation in activities that his medical training should have recognized as criminal violations of human dignity. The systematic nature of their operations became increasingly evident as their activities expanded to include not just opportunistic exploitation of natural deaths, but active orchestration of fatalities that could provide fresh corpses meeting their increasingly sophisticated criteria for beauty and spiritual purity. The transition from grave robbing to premeditated murder marked a crucial escalation that would eventually contribute to their discovery and prosecution. The methods employed for orchestrating these additional deaths reflected their growing confidence and operational capabilities as they developed techniques for poisoning, accident arrangement, and medical manipulation that could eliminate targeted individuals while maintaining plausible deniability about the artificial nature of their demise. These activities required infiltration of convent medical care systems and corruption of healthcare providers who could be bribed or blackmailed into cooperation. The psychological effects of systematic murder on the participants revealed patterns of moral degradation that exceeded what had been observed during their earlier activities involving naturally deceased victims. The active taking of innocent life created additional psychological bonds between participants, while eliminating whatever residual moral constraints might have limited the scope of their violations. The community impact of their expanding operations began to attract attention from individuals whose oversight responsibilities should have led to earlier detection of their criminal activities. The statistical anomalies represented by increasing death rates among young, healthy nuns required explanations that tested the credulity of even the most trusting religious authorities, while the mysterious circumstances surrounding several deaths created suspicions that eventually led to preliminary investigations. As their second year of operations reached its midpoint, Brother Giacomo and his disciples had successfully established an industrial-scale system for the systematic violation of innocent corpses that exceeded anything previously documented in criminal history. The night harvest had become a regular feature of their religious life, transforming the sacred rhythms of monastic existence into opportunities for blasphemous activities that served appetites too depraved for normal human comprehension. The techniques had been perfected, the organization had been refined, and the stage was set for an escalation of activities that would eventually claim dozens of victims while demonstrating the depths of evil that could emerge when religious authority was corrupted by individuals whose souls had been claimed by forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. The harvest was reaching industrial proportions, and the beautiful nuns of Santa Maria delle Grazie were about to discover that their greatest danger came not from worldly temptations, but from the very men they trusted to protect their spiritual welfare and guard their eternal rest. The night belonged to the disciples of darkness, and they were preparing to claim every innocent soul that fell within reach of their systematically organized campaign of necrophilic horror. Chapter 7. Feeding the Beast. Escalating Perversions. The insatiable hunger that had been awakened through months of systematic necrophilia demanded increasingly elaborate and extreme forms of gratification that pushed Brother Giacomo and his disciples beyond the boundaries of mere corpse violation into realms of depravity that challenged the very concept of evil itself. By the spring of 1475, their operations had evolved from opportunistic grave robbing into a comprehensive system of murder, preservation, and ritualistic abuse that transformed the monastery and its surrounding grounds into a vast charnel house, dedicated to appetites that hell itself would have found difficult to accommodate. The psychological transformation that had occurred within the Brotherhood during their second year of operations reflected the addictive nature of systematic transgression and the way that successful violation of moral boundaries inevitably led to the pursuit of ever greater extremes of corruption. The satisfaction that had once been achieved through simple necrophilic acts now required elaborate ceremonies, multiple simultaneous victims, and forms of corpse manipulation that combined elements of sexual violation with ritualistic torture that continued long after death had ended the victim's capacity for physical suffering. Brother Giacomo's role as the theological architect of their expanding atrocities required the continuous development of new justifications that could accommodate practices that exceeded even his original perverted vision of sanctified necrophilia. His private writings from this period, discovered years later during the investigation of their crimes, revealed a mind that had achieved complete liberation from conventional moral constraints, while maintaining the intellectual sophistication necessary to create systematic frameworks for unprecedented evil. The theological innovations that emerged during this period included doctrines about the spiritual benefits of post-mortem suffering, theories about the purification of souls through physical violation of their earthly remains, and elaborate hierarchies of spiritual development that could only be achieved through participation in activities that ordinary believers would recognize as absolute blasphemy. These intellectual constructs provided participants with rationalizations that transformed their criminal activities into forms of religious devotion that supposedly served divine purposes. The practical implementation of these theoretical frameworks required the development of increasingly sophisticated facilities and procedures that could accommodate the expanded scope of their operations while maintaining the secrecy that was essential for their continued survival. The underground complex beneath the monastery had been enlarged to include specialized chambers designed for different types of ritualistic activities, while the preservation and storage systems had been upgraded to handle the increased volume of corpses that their expanded operations required. The most disturbing addition to their facilities was a chamber that had been specifically designed for the systematic torture of living victims before their deaths, allowing the monks to combine the satisfaction of inflicting suffering with the anticipation of post-mortem violations that would continue for months after their targets had been murdered. This innovation marked a crucial psychological threshold that completed their transformation from necrophiles into something far more dangerous, serial killers whose appetite for death was matched only by their desire to violate their victims' remains. The selection process for living victims had become increasingly systematic and sophisticated, as the monks developed detailed profiles of potential targets based on criteria that included not just physical beauty and apparent spiritual purity, but also factors such as family connections, social isolation, and likelihood of generating intensive investigations if they disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The resulting target lists included dozens of nuns from convents throughout Tuscany, creating the foundation for a campaign of systematic murder that would eventually claim more victims than most military conflicts. Sister Benedetta da Siena became their first deliberately murdered victim through a process that demonstrated the complete corruption of whatever human empathy might have once existed within their souls. Her selection was based on her exceptional beauty, her reputation for spiritual devotion, and most cynically, her lack of influential family connections that might have triggered intensive investigations into her disappearance. The method chosen for her elimination, slow poisoning that created symptoms resembling natural illness, allowed them to monitor her decline while planning the violations that would follow her death. The murder of Sister Benedetta required infiltration of her convent's medical care systems through bribery and corruption of healthcare providers who could administer the toxins while maintaining the appearance of legitimate treatment for her supposed illness. The monks' growing network of criminal contacts provided access to poisons and delivery methods that could eliminate targets while leaving minimal evidence that might indicate deliberate murder rather than natural death. The psychological satisfaction that the monks derived from observing Sister Benedetta's gradual decline revealed the sadistic dimensions of their corruption that had evolved far beyond simple necrophilic desires into genuine enjoyment of innocent suffering. Brother Giacomo's visits to provide spiritual comfort during her final illness were motivated primarily by the pleasure he derived from watching the effects of his poisoning while maintaining the appearance of holy concern for her spiritual welfare. The violation of Sister Benedetta's remains after her death incorporated innovations that reflected their growing expertise and escalating appetites for extreme forms of corpse desecration. The ritualistic procedures that had been developed for these occasions now included elements of systematic torture that continued for hours after exhumation, while the preservation techniques that followed allowed for extended periods of repeated violation that could continue for months. The success of their first premeditated murder led to immediate planning for additional killings that would provide fresh victims while testing the limits of their operational capabilities. Sister Chiara di Firenze, whose beauty had attracted attention throughout the region, became their second murder victim through methods that replicated and refined the techniques that had proven successful in eliminating Sister Benedetta. The expansion of their murder operations required organizational innovations that reflected their transformation from a small group of necrophiles into something approaching an industrial-scale death machine. The responsibilities for target selection, murder planning, execution, and post-mortem processing were distributed among specialized teams whose coordination required increasingly complex communication and scheduling systems. Brother Lorenzo's expertise in poison preparation and administration made him the natural choice to head their assassination division, while Brother Antonio's knowledge of preservation techniques qualified him to oversee the post-mortem processing that prepared victims for extended periods of violation. The newer recruits were assigned supporting roles that gradually introduced them to direct participation in murder, while ensuring that every member of the Brotherhood became complicit in crimes that would bind them together through shared guilt. The financial requirements of their expanding operations had grown beyond what could be supported through conventional monastery resources, requiring the development of alternative income sources that further compromised their religious integrity. The most lucrative of these enterprises involved the sale of holy relics that were actually fragments of their victims' remains, marketed to wealthy collectors who believed they were purchasing genuine religious artifacts with supernatural properties. The theological justifications that accompanied these commercial activities drew on legitimate traditions of relic veneration, while perverting their essential meanings in ways that transformed the systematic desecration of innocent corpses into supposedly sacred commerce. The monks convinced themselves and their customers that the remains of beautiful nuns who had died under mysterious circumstances possessed enhanced spiritual properties that made them more valuable than conventional religious artifacts. The preservation techniques that supported their relic trade required increasingly sophisticated knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, as different body parts needed to be processed according to different procedures that could maintain their physical integrity while enhancing their market value. The specialized equipment and materials required for these operations were acquired through networks of criminal contacts who provided goods and services that could not be obtained through legitimate channels. The psychological effects of commercializing their victims' remains created additional forms of moral corruption that completed their transformation from religious figures into something that could only be described as demonic entrepreneurs, whose business model was based on the systematic murder and violation of innocent women. The financial success of their operations provided validation for activities that they had originally justified through theological arguments, but now pursued primarily for material profit. The community impact of their escalating operations began to create patterns that should have triggered intensive investigations from religious and secular authorities. The statistical anomalies represented by dramatically increasing death rates among young nuns in communities served by the monks' ministry could no longer be explained through natural causes, while the mysterious circumstances surrounding multiple deaths created suspicions that eventually reached officials with the authority and resources to conduct systematic investigations. The security measures that the monks implemented to protect their operations from discovery reflected their growing awareness that their activities had reached scales that made detection increasingly likely. The protocols for disposing of evidence, managing witnesses, and corrupting potential investigators were systematized and refined, while contingency plans were developed for responding to various forms of official scrutiny. The most important of these security measures involved the systematic corruption of officials whose oversight responsibilities made them potential threats to continued operations. Through combinations of bribery, blackmail, and theological manipulation, they created networks of protection that shielded their activities from official investigation while providing early warning about potential threats to their operational security. As their third year of operations began, Brother Giacomo and his disciples had created an unprecedented system for the systematic murder and violation of innocent women that exceeded anything previously documented in criminal history. The beast had been fed through increasingly elaborate offerings, but its appetite continued to grow in ways that demanded ever greater extremes of depravity and ever larger numbers of victims to satisfy its insatiable hunger for innocent blood and violated flesh. The escalation was becoming exponential, the operations were approaching industrial scale, and the stage was set for atrocities that would eventually claim dozens of victims while creating legends of systematic evil that would haunt Italian folklore for centuries to come. The monks who had once served God had become servants of forces far darker and more ancient than anything that holy orders were designed to contain, and their harvest of innocence was about to reach proportions that would shock even the most jaded observers of Renaissance religious corruption. The beast was fully awakened now. and its hunger would not be satisfied until every beautiful nun in Tuscany had been claimed as tribute to appetites that transcended every boundary between the sacred and the profane, the living and the dead, and the human and the demonic. Chapter 8. The Unholy Trinity, Masters of Death. The division of labour that emerged within Brother Giacomo's expanding criminal enterprise during the summer of 1475 reflected the natural talents and psychological predispositions of the three core members who had transformed themselves from corrupt monks into the most sophisticated practitioners of systematic murder and necrophilia in European history. Each man had developed specializations that maximized the efficiency of their operations while satisfying the particular forms of depravity that motivated his individual participation in their collective campaign of evil. Brother Giacomo maintained his position as supreme leader and chief theologian, providing the intellectual frameworks that justified their escalating atrocities while exercising absolute authority over strategic decisions about targeting, methodology, and organizational development. His role had evolved from that of simple criminal mastermind into something approaching a dark messiah, who preached a gospel of sanctified evil that convinced his followers they were engaged in the highest form of religious devotion rather than the systematic violation of everything sacred in human existence. The theological writings that Giacomo produced during this period revealed a mind that had achieved complete liberation from conventional moral constraints while maintaining the intellectual sophistication necessary to create systematic justifications for unprecedented evil. His private manuscripts, written in a mixture of Latin and vernacular Italian, described elaborate hierarchies of spiritual development that could only be achieved through participation in activities that ordinary believers would recognize as absolute blasphemy. The most disturbing aspect of Giacomo's theological innovations was their internal consistency and logical coherence, as he had developed comprehensive worldviews that could accommodate virtually any form of criminal behavior while presenting it as evidence of superior spiritual understanding. His arguments drew on legitimate mystical traditions while inverting their essential meanings, creating doctrinal frameworks that transformed the systematic murder and violation of innocent women into supposedly sacred acts that served divine purposes. Brother Lorenzo da Pisa had emerged as the organization's primary assassin and poison specialist, developing expertise in toxicology and murder techniques that allowed him to eliminate targeted victims while maintaining plausible deniability about the artificial nature of their deaths. His background in medical studies had provided him with knowledge of human physiology that he applied to perfecting methods of killing that could be disguised as natural illnesses or accidents. The poison laboratory that Lorenzo established in hidden chambers beneath the monastery chapel represented a masterpiece of criminal innovation that combined legitimate pharmaceutical knowledge with techniques that had been developed by professional assassins throughout Italian history. His collection of toxic substances included not just conventional poisons like arsenic and mercury compounds, but exotic materials derived from rare plants and mineral substances that could produce symptoms resembling various natural diseases. The delivery methods that Lorenzo developed for administering these lethal substances reflected his understanding of the medical care systems that operated within religious communities. His techniques for contaminating food, water, religious objects, and even sacramental materials allowed him to eliminate targets while maintaining the appearance of providing legitimate healthcare or spiritual guidance. The gradual nature of most poisoning processes meant that weeks or months could pass between initial exposure and death, creating timelines that seemed natural to observers who had no reason to suspect deliberate murder. The psychological profile that Lorenzo presented to the outside world was that of a dedicated monk whose apparent devotion to caring for the sick and dying made him a valued member of the religious community. His reputation for selfless service during medical crises provided him with access to potential victims while ensuring that his presence during their final illnesses would be interpreted as evidence of holy compassion rather than criminal intent. Brother Antonio Vespucci had become the organization's master of preservation and corpse preparation, developing techniques for maintaining human remains in conditions that could support extended periods of violation, while creating commercial products that could be marketed as religious relics. His expertise in anatomy and chemistry had been enhanced through consultation with embalmers, anatomists, and practitioners of various forms of folk magic who possessed specialized knowledge about post-mortem procedures. The preservation facilities that Antonio established represented unprecedented innovations in the handling of human remains for criminal purposes. His techniques combined elements of legitimate mortuary science with procedures that had been developed specifically for maintaining corpses in conditions suitable for repeated sexual violation. The chemical treatments and environmental controls that he employed could extend the usability of remains far beyond what natural preservation would have allowed. The commercial aspects of Antonio's operations reflected the transformation of their criminal enterprise from simple necrophilia into a comprehensive business model based on the systematic exploitation of murdered victims. The relic trade that he had developed provided substantial revenues while creating legitimate cover for activities that would have been difficult to explain through conventional religious functions. His customers, who included wealthy collectors throughout Europe, believed they were purchasing genuine religious artifacts with supernatural properties. The anatomical knowledge that Antonio had acquired through his work with corpses allowed him to develop products that maximized both commercial value and personal satisfaction. Different body parts could be processed according to different procedures that enhanced their market appeal while serving the specific desires of individual customers. The specialized equipment and materials required for these operations represented significant investments that reflected the financial success of their overall enterprise. The coordination between the three core members had evolved into a seamless system of criminal cooperation that maximized operational efficiency while distributing responsibilities according to individual expertise and psychological preferences. Their regular planning sessions combined elements of business meetings with religious ceremonies, creating unique forms of blasphemous worship that used the vocabulary of holiness to justify systematic murder and violation. The target selection process that they had developed reflected their collective expertise and the sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities that they had established throughout the region. Giacomo's theological authority provided him with access to information about the spiritual development and personal characteristics of potential victims, while Lorenzo's medical connections allowed him to evaluate their health status and susceptibility to various forms of poisoning. Antonio's commercial networks provided intelligence about market demand for specific types of products that could influence targeting decisions. The operational protocols that governed their activities had been refined through years of experience and reflected their understanding of investigative techniques that might be employed by authorities who suspected criminal activity. Their methods for eliminating evidence, managing witnesses, and maintaining operational security represented sophisticated applications of criminal tradecraft that exceeded the capabilities of most law enforcement agencies of their era. The recruitment and training of additional participants continued throughout this period, as their success in conducting systematic operations without detection convinced potential converts that their activities enjoyed supernatural protection that placed them beyond the reach of earthly authorities. The indoctrination procedures that they had developed could efficiently transform individuals with various backgrounds and motivations into committed participants in activities that violated every principle of Christian civilization. The expansion of their operations to include other monasteries and religious communities throughout Tuscany reflected their growing confidence and organizational capabilities. The network of contacts and resources that they had developed provided them with opportunities to extend their influence while creating additional revenue sources that could support even larger-scale operations. Brother Matteo da Siena had become their primary recruiter and expansion coordinator, using his social connections and apparent theological expertise to identify suitable candidates for recruitment, while establishing operational bases in communities that could provide access to new populations of potential victims. His background as a former university student provided him with intellectual credibility that impressed potential recruits who might have been suspicious of more obviously corrupt individuals. The communication systems that coordinated activities between different locations represented innovative applications of existing technologies and organizational structures. The regular travel that was normal for religious officials provided cover for meetings and coordination activities, while the correspondence networks that connected various religious communities could be used to transmit coded messages about operational matters. The financial management of their expanding enterprise required increasingly sophisticated accounting and resource allocation procedures that reflected their transformation from simple criminal conspiracy into something approaching a multinational corporation dedicated to systematic murder and violation. The revenues generated through their various illegal activities had reached levels that required investment strategies and money laundering techniques that could provide security while facilitating continued growth. As autumn approached and their fourth year of operations began, the unholy trinity had successfully created an organizational structure that combined religious authority with criminal expertise to produce the most systematic campaign of necrophilic murder in recorded history. The Masters of Death had perfected their techniques, refined their procedures, and established operational capabilities that could support industrial-scale atrocities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious service. The specialization was complete, the coordination was seamless, and the stage was set for an expansion of activities that would eventually claim dozens of additional victims, while demonstrating the terrifying efficiency that could be achieved when evil was organized according to rational principles and pursued with the same dedication that legitimate enterprises applied to constructive purposes. The Trinity had achieved perfect cooperation in service to forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace, and their harvest of innocence was about to reach proportions that would shock the civilized world while creating legends of systematic evil that would influence criminal behavior for centuries to come. So Chapter 9, Witnesses in the Shadows, the Living Discover the Dead. The first concrete evidence that something was terribly wrong within the religious communities served by the Monastery of San Benedetto came from Sister Lucia di Montepulciano, whose duties as night guardian of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie had provided her with opportunities to observe activities that other community members missed during their hours of sleep. Her initial reports to the Mother Superior were dismissed as products of overwrought imagination and spiritual scrupulosity, but the accumulating details of her observations would eventually provide investigators with crucial intelligence about the scope and methods of the systematic violations that had been conducted under cover of darkness. Sister Lucia's vigil duties required her to maintain surveillance of the convent grounds during the hours between Compline and Lauds, ensuring that the community remained secure while providing assistance to any sisters who might require help during emergencies or spiritual crises. Her position stationed her in the bell tower that provided commanding views of the cemetery and surrounding areas, creating opportunities for observation that the monks had not anticipated when planning their clandestine activities. The first suspicious incident that Sister Lucia reported occurred during a moonless night in late October 1475, when she observed unexplained lights moving through the cemetery in patterns that suggested deliberate human activity rather than natural phenomena or supernatural manifestations. Her description of these lights included details about their duration, intensity, and movement patterns that indicated familiarity with the cemetery's layout and systematic searching of specific grave sites. The sounds that accompanied these visual observations were equally disturbing and provided additional evidence of human activity that violated the sanctity of consecrated ground. Sister Lucia reported hearing metallic scraping noises that suggested the use of digging tools, along with muffled voices and other sounds that indicated the presence of multiple individuals working in coordination. The duration of these activities, which sometimes continued for several hours, suggested systematic operations rather than casual disturbances. The most chilling aspect of Sister Lucia's early reports was her description of sounds that seemed to emanate from beneath the ground, groaning, scraping, and other noises that suggested activities involving the manipulation of buried objects or materials. Her theological training had provided her with sufficient knowledge of burial practices to recognize that normal cemetery maintenance would not require the kind of extensive excavation that these sounds seemed to indicate. The investigation that Mother Superior Caterina de Ricci conducted in response to Sister Lucia's reports was hampered by her reluctance to believe that such serious violations could be occurring without her knowledge, as well as by the sophisticated concealment techniques that the monks had developed to hide evidence of their activities. The daylight examinations of the cemetery that she ordered revealed only minor irregularities that could be explained through normal settling of soil or routine maintenance activities. But Sister Lucia's continued reports of nocturnal disturbances forced Mother Superior Caterina to consider the possibility that systematic violations were indeed occurring, leading her to authorize more intensive surveillance efforts that would eventually provide definitive evidence of criminal activity. The assignment of additional sisters to night watch duties created opportunities for corroborating observations, while reducing the likelihood that Sister Lucia's reports were products of individual psychological problems. Sister Margarita de Perugia, whose assignment to assist with night surveillance was motivated by her reputation for practical intelligence and emotional stability, provided the first corroborating evidence that convinced Mother Superior Caterina that serious crimes were being committed within the cemetery grounds. Her independent observations of unexplained lights and sounds confirmed the essential accuracy of Sister Lucia's reports, while adding details that suggested even more disturbing activities than had been initially suspected. The breakthrough that provided definitive evidence of criminal activity came when Sister Margarita observed a group of robed figures conducting what appeared to be a systematic exhumation of a recently buried nun's grave. Her position in the bell tower provided sufficient elevation to observe activities that the perpetrators believed were concealed from observation, while the clear night conditions allowed her to distinguish details about their methods and equipment that would prove crucial for later investigations. The most horrifying aspect of Sister Margarita's observations was her report that the exhumed corpse appeared to be subjected to activities that violated every principle of human dignity and Christian belief about the proper treatment of the dead. While she was unable to observe specific details of what was being done to the remains, the duration and apparent enthusiasm of the perpetrators' activities left no doubt that systematic desecration was occurring. The decision to conduct covert surveillance that could provide evidence suitable for presentation to ecclesiastical authorities required careful planning and coordination that would not alert the perpetrators to the fact that their activities had been discovered. Mother Superior Caterina authorized the establishment of concealed observation posts that could provide detailed documentation of criminal activities while ensuring the safety of sister observers who might be targeted for elimination if their surveillance was detected. The photographic documentation that was eventually obtained through these covert operations provided irrefutable evidence of systematic grave robbing and corpse violation that exceeded the worst suspicions of even the most pessimistic observers. The images captured through hidden cameras revealed activities that challenged the limits of human depravity, while demonstrating the sophisticated organization and extensive resources that supported these criminal operations. Brother Tommaso da Prato, whose duties as assistant cemetery keeper had provided him with intimate knowledge of the monks' activities, became the first insider to provide direct testimony about the scope and methods of their systematic violations. His decision to cooperate with investigators was motivated by a combination of guilt about his own participation and fear that he would be eliminated to prevent him from revealing information that could compromise the entire operation. The testimony that Brother Tommaso provided revealed details about the organizational structure and operational methods that had enabled such extensive criminal activities to continue without detection for nearly 3 years. His accounts of the recruitment and training procedures, the technological innovations and the financial arrangements that supported their operations provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of how such unprecedented crimes had been possible. The most valuable intelligence that Brother Tommaso provided concerned the locations and contents of the hidden facilities that had been constructed to support the monks' activities. His descriptions of the underground chambers, preservation equipment, and storage areas allowed investigators to plan raids that would provide physical evidence of criminal activities, while potentially rescuing any victims who might still be alive. The discovery of the underground complex beneath the Monastery of San Benedetto provided investigators with physical evidence that exceeded their worst expectations about the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise that had been operating under cover of religious authority. The facilities that were uncovered included not just storage areas for corpses and equipment, but specialized chambers that had been designed for torture, murder, and various forms of systematic violation. The inventory of materials that were found during the raids revealed the extensive resources and sophisticated techniques that had been employed in support of systematic criminal activities. The collection of poisons, preservation chemicals, surgical instruments, and specialized equipment represented investments that exceeded what most legitimate businesses could have afforded, while demonstrating the financial success of their illegal operations. The most disturbing discoveries were the detailed records that the monks had maintained documenting their activities, victims, and procedures. These documents, which had been kept for reasons that combined criminal record-keeping with theological justification, provided investigators with comprehensive evidence of crimes that spanned nearly 4 years and involved dozens of victims whose deaths had been orchestrated or exploited for systematic violation, the human remains that were discovered in various stages of preservation, and violation provided forensic evidence that confirmed the most serious charges while revealing the true scope of the atrocities that had been committed. The condition of these remains demonstrated the sophisticated preservation techniques that had been employed while providing evidence of violations that continued long after the victims' deaths. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the investigating officials and community members who learned about them created trauma that would persist for generations. The realization that such systematic evil had been operating under the cover of religious authority challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of institutional protection and the reliability of spiritual guidance. The community response to revelations about the true nature of activities that had been conducted by individuals they had trusted with their spiritual welfare and physical security created social upheaval that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The knowledge that men of God had become perpetrators of unprecedented evil forced re-evaluation of every aspect of religious life and institutional authority. As news of the discovery spread throughout the region and beyond, the case of the Monastery of San Benedetto became a watershed moment in European religious history that would influence attitudes toward clerical authority and institutional accountability for centuries to come. The witnesses who had emerged from the shadows had provided crucial evidence that enabled justice to begin its work, but the psychological and spiritual damage that had been inflicted would prove far more difficult to repair than the physical crimes that had been documented. The living had discovered the secrets of the dead, and the revelations that followed would shake the foundations of religious authority, while demonstrating that even the most sacred institutions could become vehicles for evil when they were corrupted by individuals whose souls had been claimed by forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. Chapter 10. The Web Unravels. Investigation begins. The formal investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of the Monastery of San Benedetto's systematic crimes began in earnest during the winter of 1476, when the accumulating evidence of supernatural violations had reached levels that even the most corrupt ecclesiastical authorities could no longer ignore or dismiss. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, whose reputation for thoroughness and incorruptibility had earned him appointment as the Church's primary investigator of serious clerical misconduct, arrived in Tuscany with unprecedented authority and resources to uncover the truth about activities that threatened to create the greatest scandal in Renaissance religious history. The preliminary reports that had reached Cardinal Farnese through various church channels painted a picture of criminal activity that exceeded anything previously documented in ecclesiastical records. The allegations included not just systematic grave robbing and corpse violation, but premeditated murder, commercial trafficking in human remains, and the corruption of religious institutions on a scale that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of clerical authority and institutional accountability. The investigative team that Cardinal Farnese assembled reflected the seriousness with which church authorities were approaching this unprecedented case. The personnel included not just traditional ecclesiastical investigators, but medical experts, legal scholars, and specialists in criminal behavior, who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to document and analyze evidence of activities that transcended normal categories of religious misconduct. The methodological approach that guided their investigation combined traditional church procedures with innovative techniques that had been developed for examining complex criminal enterprises. The systematic documentation of evidence, the careful interviewing of witnesses, and the forensic analysis of physical materials represented applications of investigative science that exceeded what most secular authorities could have provided during this historical period. The first phase of the investigation focused on corroborating and expanding the testimony that had been provided by the nun witnesses whose surveillance activities had initially exposed the criminal operations. The detailed questioning of Sisters Lucia and Margherita revealed additional information about the scope and frequency of nocturnal activities, while providing intelligence that could guide more intensive examination of suspected crime scenes. The forensic examination of the cemetery grounds that followed these initial interviews provided physical evidence that confirmed the most serious allegations while revealing the sophisticated techniques that had been employed to conceal systematic grave robbing and corpse violation. The careful excavation of suspected burial sites revealed clear evidence of unauthorized disturbance, while soil analysis provided chemical signatures that indicated the use of preservation materials and other substances associated with systematic corpse processing. The discovery of the underground complex beneath the monastery chapel represented the breakthrough that transformed preliminary suspicions into definitive proof of unprecedented criminal activity. The hidden chambers that were uncovered during careful excavation contained not just physical evidence of systematic violations, but detailed documentation that provided comprehensive records of activities spanning nearly 4 years of operations. The inventory of materials that were found in these hidden facilities revealed the extensive resources and sophisticated techniques that had supported such systematic criminal activities. The collection of surgical instruments, preservation chemicals, torture devices, and specialized equipment represented investments that exceeded what most legitimate institutions could have afforded, while demonstrating the financial success of illegal operations that had generated substantial revenues through various forms of criminal commerce. The most valuable evidence that was uncovered during these searches consisted of the detailed records that Brother Giacomo and his associates had maintained, documenting their activities, victims, and procedures. These documents, which had been preserved for reasons that combined practical criminal record-keeping with theological justification, provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of organizational structure, operational methods, and individual responsibilities that would prove essential for subsequent prosecution efforts. The human remains that were discovered in various stages of preservation and violation provided forensic evidence that confirmed the most serious charges while revealing the true scope of atrocities that had been committed over years of systematic operations. The condition of these remains demonstrated not just the sophisticated preservation techniques that had been employed, but the extent of violations that had continued long after the victims' original deaths. The interrogation of Brother Tommaso da Prato, whose cooperation had been secured through promises of reduced punishment in exchange for comprehensive testimony, provided investigators with detailed intelligence about recruitment procedures, training methods, and operational protocols that had enabled such extensive criminal activities to continue without detection for nearly 4 years. His accounts of the organizational hierarchy and individual responsibilities allowed investigators to develop comprehensive understanding of how such unprecedented crimes had been possible. The arrest of Brother Giacomo di Montecroce marked a crucial turning point in the investigation, as the capture of the organization's primary leader and chief theologian provided opportunities for intensive interrogation that could reveal information about activities and associates that had not been documented in the seized records. The techniques employed during his questioning reflected both traditional ecclesiastical procedures and innovative methods designed to overcome the psychological defenses of someone whose corruption exceeded normal categories of criminal behavior. The psychological evaluation of Brother Giacomo that was conducted during his initial period of confinement revealed personality characteristics and intellectual capabilities that provided insights into how such systematic evil had been possible. His apparent lack of genuine remorse for the suffering he had inflicted was accompanied by continued belief in the theological justifications that he had developed to rationalize his criminal activities, suggesting psychological corruption that exceeded anything previously documented in church records. The confession that Brother Giacomo eventually provided under intensive questioning revealed details about the scope and methods of their operations that exceeded the worst suspicions of even the most pessimistic investigators. His systematic account of organizational development, recruitment procedures, and operational expansion painted a picture of criminal enterprise that had achieved unprecedented sophistication while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious activity. The intelligence that emerged from Giacomo's confession led to the identification and arrest of numerous additional participants whose involvement had not been suspected based on the physical evidence alone. The network of corruption that was revealed through these subsequent arrests extended far beyond the original monastery to include officials, merchants, and individuals from various social backgrounds who had become complicit in activities that violated every principle of Christian civilization. The financial investigation that accompanied the criminal proceedings revealed the extensive resources that had been generated through systematic trafficking in human remains and related commercial activities. The accounting records that were discovered documented revenues that exceeded what most legitimate businesses achieved, while revealing money laundering techniques and investment strategies that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of financial management. The forensic analysis of the victims' remains provided medical evidence that supported charges of premeditated murder, while revealing the sophisticated poisoning techniques that had been employed to eliminate targeted individuals. The toxicological examinations conducted by expert physicians confirmed the presence of various poisonous substances, while demonstrating the knowledge of human physiology that had been required to orchestrate deaths that appeared natural to casual observation. The community interviews that were conducted throughout the affected region revealed the broader impact of criminal activities that had extended far beyond the immediate victims to include psychological trauma affecting entire populations who had trusted their spiritual welfare to individuals who had been systematically violating everything sacred in human existence. The testimonies provided by community members painted a picture of systematic deception and manipulation that had exploited religious authority to facilitate unprecedented crimes. The documentary evidence that was assembled during the investigation provided comprehensive proof of criminal activities that spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved numerous accomplices whose roles had been carefully coordinated to maximize operational efficiency while minimizing the risk of detection. The systematic nature of record-keeping that the criminals had maintained actually facilitated prosecution efforts by providing detailed evidence that would have been difficult to obtain through other investigative methods. The international implications of the case began to emerge as investigators discovered connections between the Tuscan operations and similar activities in other regions throughout Europe. The correspondence and commercial records that were uncovered revealed networks of criminal collaboration that extended far beyond the original monastery, suggesting that systematic necrophilic enterprises had been established in multiple locations using similar organizational models and operational techniques. The theological analysis that was conducted by church scholars revealed the sophisticated intellectual frameworks that had been developed to justify activities that violated every principle of Christian doctrine and moral teaching. The perverted theological arguments that had been documented in seized materials represented systematic corruption of legitimate religious traditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between intellectual sophistication and moral behavior. As the investigation entered its second year, Cardinal Farnese and his team had assembled evidence that documented the most comprehensive case of systematic religious corruption in church history. The web that had been carefully constructed to conceal unprecedented criminal activities had been systematically unraveled through methodical investigation that revealed every aspect of operations that had claimed dozens of innocent lives while generating substantial profits through the systematic violation of human dignity and Christian belief. The stage was set for judicial proceedings that would test the ability of existing legal frameworks to address crimes that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior, while challenging every assumption about the nature of religious authority and institutional accountability. The investigation had revealed the full scope of evil that could emerge when spiritual institutions were corrupted by individuals whose souls had been claimed by forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. Chapter 11. Confessions of the Damned. Truth Revealed. The torture chamber deep beneath the Palazzo del Podestà in Florence had witnessed centuries of judicial interrogation, but nothing in its blood-soaked history had prepared its stone walls for the confessions that would pour forth from Brother Lorenzo da Pisa during the winter months of 1477. The systematic application of enhanced interrogation techniques, sanctioned by both ecclesiastical and secular authorities, would eventually extract testimony that revealed the true scope of depravity that had been practiced by the monks of San Benedetto, creating a record of evil that challenged every assumption about the limits of human corruption. The physical methods employed to encourage Brother Lorenzo's cooperation reflected both traditional judicial practices and innovative techniques that had been developed specifically for cases involving individuals whose psychological conditioning made them resistant to conventional interrogation approaches. The rack, the strappado, and various forms of water torture were supplemented by procedures designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of someone whose religious background had created particular psychological sensitivities to certain forms of suffering. The progression of Lorenzo's confessions followed patterns that revealed the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise he had served. beginning with reluctant admissions about minor infractions and gradually expanding to include detailed accounts of activities that exceeded the most pessimistic expectations of his interrogators. The careful documentation of each revelation provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of organizational structure, operational methods, and individual responsibilities that would prove essential for subsequent prosecution efforts. The first significant breakthrough in Lorenzo's interrogation came when the combination of physical stress and psychological pressure overcame his resistance to discussing his role in poison preparation and administration. His detailed descriptions of toxicological techniques and victim selection criteria revealed the scientific sophistication that had enabled systematic murder while maintaining the appearance of natural deaths that attracted minimal investigative attention. The poison laboratory that Lorenzo described in his expanding confessions represented a masterpiece of criminal innovation that had combined legitimate pharmaceutical knowledge with techniques developed specifically for undetectable assassination. His inventory of toxic substances included not just conventional poisons like arsenic and mercury compounds, but exotic materials derived from rare plants, fungi, and mineral substances that could produce symptoms resembling various natural diseases. The delivery methods that Lorenzo had perfected for administering these lethal substances demonstrated his understanding of the medical care systems that operated within religious communities. His techniques for contaminating food, water, religious objects, and even sacramental materials had allowed him to eliminate dozens of targeted victims while maintaining the appearance of providing legitimate healthcare or spiritual guidance. The victim list that emerged from Lorenzo's detailed confessions exceeded even the most pessimistic estimates that investigators had developed based on physical evidence and documentary records. His systematic accounting of assassination assignments revealed that their operations had claimed the lives of at least 47 nuns over a period of nearly 4 years, with additional victims whose deaths had been orchestrated through methods that left no clear evidence of criminal involvement. The selection criteria that had governed victim targeting reflected the sophisticated intelligence-gathering capabilities that the organization had developed throughout the region. Lorenzo's descriptions of surveillance methods, intelligence networks, and assessment procedures revealed systematic approaches to identifying potential targets based on factors that included physical beauty, spiritual reputation, family connections, and likelihood of generating intensive investigations if they disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The most chilling aspect of Lorenzo's confessions was his detailed account of the psychological satisfaction that he had derived from observing the gradual decline of his poison victims. His descriptions of visits to provide spiritual comfort during manufactured final illnesses revealed sadistic pleasure in watching the effects of his toxins while maintaining the appearance of holy concern for their spiritual welfare. The confession sessions that focused on post-mortem activities required even more intensive interrogation techniques, as Lorenzo's resistance to discussing corpse violation was significantly greater than his reluctance to admit involvement in murder. The psychological conditioning that had made necrophilic activities seem acceptable within the context of their perverted theology proved more difficult to overcome than the rationalizations that had justified assassination. The breakthrough that led to comprehensive testimony about systematic corpse violation came when interrogators employed techniques that exploited Lorenzo's medical background and scientific curiosity. By framing their questions in terms that emphasized the technical and procedural aspects of preservation and anatomical manipulation, they were able to overcome his emotional resistance while obtaining detailed information about activities that had continued for months after each victim's death. The preservation techniques that Lorenzo described represented unprecedented innovations in the criminal manipulation of human remains for purposes that combined sexual gratification with commercial exploitation. His accounts of chemical treatments, environmental controls, and anatomical procedures revealed knowledge that exceeded what most legitimate medical practitioners possessed, while demonstrating the extensive resources and sophisticated equipment that had supported their operations. The commercial aspects of their operations, which Lorenzo initially attempted to minimize or deny, eventually became the subject of comprehensive testimony that revealed the financial sophistication of criminal enterprises that had generated substantial revenues through systematic trafficking in human remains. His descriptions of customer networks, product development, and marketing strategies painted a picture of business operations that had achieved remarkable success while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious commerce. The relic trade that had provided their primary source of external revenue represented a particularly disturbing example of how religious authority could be exploited to facilitate systematic criminal activity. Lorenzo's detailed accounts of product preparation, quality control, and customer service revealed business practices that would have been impressive in legitimate commerce while serving purposes that violated every principle of human dignity and Christian belief. The organizational structure that emerged from Lorenzo's expanding confessions revealed sophisticated management techniques that had enabled effective coordination of complex criminal activities while maintaining operational security that had prevented detection for nearly 4 years. His descriptions of hierarchy, specialization, communication protocols, and resource allocation demonstrated understanding of administrative principles that exceeded what most contemporary institutions achieved. The recruitment and training procedures that Lorenzo described provided insights into how seemingly respectable religious figures had been systematically corrupted into enthusiastic participants in unprecedented criminal activities. His accounts of selection criteria, indoctrination methods, and performance evaluation revealed psychological manipulation techniques that had proven remarkably effective in transforming individuals with various backgrounds and motivations into committed participants in systematic evil. The theological justifications that had provided intellectual frameworks for their criminal activities became subjects of detailed confession testimony that revealed the sophisticated arguments that had been developed to rationalize activities that violated every principle of Christian doctrine and moral teaching. Lorenzo's ability to articulate these perverted theological positions demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that had made such systematic corruption possible. The most disturbing aspect of Lorenzo's theological testimony was his continued belief in many of the justifications that had originally motivated his participation, suggesting psychological corruption that exceeded anything previously documented in ecclesiastical records. Even under intensive interrogation and facing certain execution, he maintained that their activities had served legitimate spiritual purposes that transcended conventional moral limitations. The intelligence that Lorenzo provided about related operations in other regions throughout Europe revealed networks of criminal collaboration that extended far beyond the original Tuscan monastery. His descriptions of correspondence, personnel exchanges, and resource sharing suggested that systematic necrophilic enterprises had been established in multiple locations using similar organizational models and operational techniques. The financial records that Lorenzo was able to reconstruct from memory provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of revenue sources, expense categories, and investment strategies that had supported such extensive criminal operations. His accounting of profits, costs, and asset allocation revealed business management principles that had enabled sustainable growth while funding increasingly elaborate facilities and procedures. The security measures that had protected their operations from detection became subjects of detailed testimony that revealed sophisticated understanding of investigative techniques and countermeasures that had proven remarkably effective in preventing discovery despite the scale and duration of their criminal activities. Lorenzo's descriptions of surveillance detection, evidence elimination, and witness management demonstrated tradecraft that exceeded what most legitimate intelligence services achieved. The psychological impact of providing such comprehensive confessions began to affect Lorenzo in ways that suggested genuine recognition of the magnitude of evil in which he had participated, though his expressions of remorse remained focused primarily on the consequences he faced rather than the suffering that had been inflicted on innocent victims. His emotional responses during particularly detailed testimony sessions revealed personality characteristics that provided insights into how such systematic corruption had been possible. As Lorenzo's confessions reached their conclusion, after months of intensive interrogation, the investigators had obtained testimony that documented the most comprehensive case of systematic religious corruption in European history. The truth that had been revealed through such painstaking extraction exceeded the worst suspicions of even the most pessimistic observers, while providing evidence that would support judicial proceedings against individuals whose crimes transcended normal categories of criminal behavior. The confessions of the damned had laid bare every aspect of operations that had claimed dozens of innocent lives while generating substantial profits through the systematic violation of human dignity and Christian belief. the stage was set for judicial proceedings that would test the ability of existing legal frameworks to address crimes that challenged every assumption about the nature of religious authority and the limits of human evil. Chapter 12. Trial of the Century, Judgment Day. The Great Hall of the Palazzo del Bargello in Florence had been transformed into an arena where the forces of divine justice would confront evil so systematic and comprehensive that it challenged every assumption about the nature of human morality and the effectiveness of Christian civilization in preventing the complete corruption of souls that had been entrusted with the most sacred responsibilities. On the morning of March 15, 1478, Brother Giacomo di Montecroce and 14 of his surviving co-conspirators stood before a tribunal whose composition reflected the unprecedented nature of their crimes. Ecclesiastical judges representing the highest levels of church authority, secular magistrates whose legal expertise encompassed both canon and civil law, and theological consultants whose knowledge of moral doctrine would be essential for addressing charges that transcended normal categories of criminal behaviour. The charges that were read aloud by Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in his capacity as chief prosecutor created a litany of evil that seemed to emerge from the deepest circles of hell rather than the supposedly sacred precincts of Renaissance religious life. The formal accusations included not just the murder of 47 nuns through systematic poisoning, but the violation of their corpses through acts of necrophilia that had continued for months after their deaths, the commercial trafficking of human remains disguised as religious relics, and the corruption of church institutions on a scale that threatened the spiritual foundations of Christian civilization. The physical evidence that had been assembled to support these charges filled entire chambers within the palace complex, creating what contemporary observers described as a museum of horrors that documented evil beyond the capacity of normal human imagination to comprehend. The preserved corpses that had been discovered in various stages of violation provided forensic proof of activities that had continued long after the victims' original deaths, while the specialized equipment and facilities that had been uncovered revealed the industrial scale and sophisticated organization that had enabled such systematic atrocities. The documentary evidence that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case consisted of detailed records that the defendants themselves had maintained, documenting their activities, victims, and procedures with the methodical thoroughness of accountants managing a successful business enterprise. These materials, which had been preserved for reasons that combined practical criminal record-keeping with theological justification, provided investigators with comprehensive understanding of organizational structure and operational methods that would have been impossible to obtain through other investigative techniques. Brother Giacomo's appearance in the dock revealed the physical and psychological toll that months of imprisonment and interrogation had taken on someone whose intellectual arrogance had once made him seem invulnerable to normal forms of pressure or intimidation. His emaciated form and haunted expression suggested that even his corrupted soul retained sufficient humanity to experience some recognition of the magnitude of evil in which he had participated, though his responses to questioning would reveal that his capacity for genuine remorse remained limited. The defense strategy that had been developed by the canonical lawyers representing the accused reflected the unprecedented challenges of defending individuals whose crimes exceeded normal categories of criminal behavior, while challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious authority and moral responsibility. Their arguments focused primarily on questions of mental competency and supernatural influence rather than substantive denials of the charges, attempting to demonstrate that their clients had been acting under forms of demonic possession or psychological compulsion that mitigated their moral culpability. The theological testimony that occupied the first weeks of proceedings required detailed examination of the intellectual frameworks that had been developed to justify activities that violated every principle of Christian doctrine and moral teaching. The perverted theological arguments that had been documented in seized materials represented systematic corruption of legitimate religious traditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between intellectual sophistication and moral behavior. Father Antonino da Messina, whose reputation as a theologian and exorcist had earned him appointment as the tribunal's primary expert on matters of spiritual corruption, provided detailed analysis of the doctrinal innovations that had enabled such systematic evil to present itself as legitimate religious activity. his testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of theological arguments that had been developed to rationalize unprecedented crimes while maintaining the appearance of orthodox Christian belief. The most disturbing aspect of Father Antonino's analysis was his conclusion that the theological frameworks that had guided the defendant's activities represented genuine intellectual achievements that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of religious doctrine combined with systematic inversion of its essential meanings. This recognition that evil could achieve high levels of intellectual sophistication while maintaining internal logical consistency challenged comfortable assumptions about the relationship between education and moral behavior. The medical testimony that documented the methods employed for systematic murder revealed the scientific knowledge and technical sophistication that had enabled the elimination of dozens of victims while maintaining the appearance of natural deaths that attracted minimal investigative attention. Dr. Marsilio Ficino, whose expertise in both medicine and natural philosophy had made him one of Renaissance Europe's most respected authorities on toxicology, provided detailed analysis of poisoning techniques that exceeded what most contemporary physicians could have achieved. The forensic examination of victims' remains that Dr. Ficino conducted for the tribunal revealed not just evidence of systematic poisoning, but indicators of post-mortem treatment that confirmed the most serious charges of corpse violation, while demonstrating the preservation techniques that had enabled extended periods of repeated abuse. His testimony about the condition of recovered remains provided the court with medical evidence that supported every aspect of the prosecution's case, while revealing details about criminal activities that exceeded the most pessimistic expectations. The psychological evaluation of the defendants that was conducted by experts in moral theology and natural philosophy provided insights into the mental processes and personality characteristics that had enabled such systematic participation in unprecedented evil. The examination of Brother Giacomo revealed intellectual capabilities that had been systematically perverted to serve criminal purposes, while maintaining sufficient coherence to plan and execute complex operations over extended periods. The most chilling aspect of these psychological evaluations was the absence of genuine remorse or recognition of moral wrongdoing among the defendants, who continued to maintain that their activities had served legitimate spiritual purposes that transcended conventional moral limitations. This psychological profile suggested corruption that exceeded normal categories of mental illness, while remaining sufficiently organized to support sophisticated criminal enterprises. The testimony provided by surviving victims who had escaped the defendants' planned murders created emotional moments that demonstrated the human cost of crimes that might otherwise have been considered primarily as violations of abstract moral principles. Sister Francesca da Pistoia, who had survived a poisoning attempt through timely medical intervention, provided detailed accounts of the systematic deception and manipulation that had been employed to gain access to potential victims while maintaining the appearance of legitimate spiritual guidance. The commercial aspects of the defendants' operations received detailed examination through testimony from customers, suppliers, and financial intermediaries who had become involved in trafficking networks that had generated substantial revenues through the systematic exploitation of murdered victims. The business records that were presented as evidence revealed sophisticated understanding of market demand and customer service that would have been impressive in legitimate commerce, while serving purposes that violated every principle of human dignity. The international implications of the case began to emerge through testimony about connections between the Tuscan operations and similar activities in other regions throughout Europe. The correspondence and commercial records that were presented as evidence revealed networks of criminal collaboration that extended far beyond the original monastery, suggesting that systematic necrophilic enterprises had been established in multiple locations using similar organizational models and operational techniques. The community impact testimony that documented the broader effects of criminal activities on populations who had trusted their spiritual welfare to individuals who had been systematically violating everything sacred in human existence created powerful emotional responses that demonstrated the social damage that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The testimonies provided by community members painted a picture of systematic deception and manipulation that had exploited religious authority to facilitate unprecedented crimes. The final arguments presented by both prosecution and defense reflected the unprecedented nature of charges that challenged existing legal frameworks, while requiring innovations in jurisprudential thinking that could accommodate crimes transcending normal categories of criminal behaviour. Cardinal Farnese's summation emphasised the systematic nature of activities that had transformed religious institutions into engines of systematic evil, while the defence attorneys focused on questions of mental competency and supernatural influence that might mitigate their clients' moral responsibility. The deliberations that followed the conclusion of testimony lasted for weeks, as the tribunal struggled to develop verdicts that could address crimes exceeding anything previously documented in ecclesiastical or secular legal records. The judges faced challenges that went beyond simple questions of guilt or innocence to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of evil and the appropriate responses of Christian civilization to corruption that threatened its spiritual foundations. The verdicts that were finally announced on June 21, 1478, reflected the tribunal's recognition that they were confronting evil that exceeded normal categories of criminal behaviour while requiring responses that could protect society from future occurrences of similar systematic corruption. Brother Giacomo and his closest associates were condemned to death by burning, while lesser participants received sentences that range from life imprisonment to various forms of public penance, designed to demonstrate the Church's rejection of activities that had violated every principle of Christian civilization. The trial of the century had concluded with verdicts that satisfied demands for justice, while establishing precedents that would influence the treatment of systematic religious corruption for generations to come. The Judgment Day had arrived for individuals whose crimes had challenged every assumption about the limits of human evil and the effectiveness of religious institutions in preventing the complete moral collapse of souls entrusted with sacred responsibilities. The Chapter 13, Divine Wrath, Punishment and Execution, the scaffold that was erected in the Piazza della Signoria for the execution of Brother Giacomo di Montecroce and his principal accomplices, represented more than a simple instrument of capital punishment. It was a stage upon which the forces of divine justice would demonstrate their ultimate authority over evil that had challenged the very foundations of Christian civilization. The elaborate preparations that preceded the executions reflected both the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the determination of ecclesiastical and secular authorities to ensure that the punishments would serve as eternal warnings about the consequences of systematic corruption within religious institutions. The design of the execution apparatus had been modified specifically to accommodate the theological requirements of cases involving individuals whose crimes transcended normal categories of criminal behaviour, while involving violations of sacred trust that demanded responses exceeding conventional capital punishment. The pyres that would consume the condemned monks were constructed according to specifications that drew on both traditional practices and innovations designed to ensure that their deaths would serve educational as well as punitive purposes. The crowds that gathered to witness these unprecedented executions represented every level of society throughout central Italy. As news of the trials had attracted attention that extended far beyond the immediate region to encompass observers who recognized the historical significance of proceedings that had exposed systematic evil within institutions that were supposed to represent the highest aspirations of Christian civilization. The diversity of spectators reflected both morbid curiosity about the details of unprecedented crimes and genuine desire to witness divine justice applied to corruption that had challenged fundamental assumptions about religious authority. Brother Giacomo's final journey from his prison cell to the execution site was conducted according to protocols that emphasized both the gravity of his crimes and the mercy of church authorities, who continued to offer opportunities for genuine repentance even in the final moments before divine judgment. The procession that accompanied him through the streets of Florence included not only the usual complement of guards and officials, but theological advisors whose presence demonstrated the Church's continued hope that even the most corrupted souls might achieve salvation through sincere contrition. The psychological state that Brother Giacomo displayed during these final hours revealed the complex mixture of intellectual arrogance and growing fear that characterized someone whose systematic evil had been thoroughly exposed while his rationalizations had been systematically dismantled through months of intensive interrogation and theological examination. His physical appearance reflected the toll that imprisonment and interrogation had taken, while his responses to spiritual counselling suggested that, Whatever capacity for genuine repentance might have remained within his corrupted soul was insufficient to overcome the pride and intellectual vanity that had originally motivated his descent into systematic evil. The final confession that Brother Giacomo provided to his spiritual advisors on the morning of his execution included additional details about criminal activities that had not been fully revealed during the trial proceedings, suggesting that even the comprehensive evidence that had been assembled by investigators represented only a portion of the atrocities that had been committed over nearly 4 years of systematic operations. These final revelations would later be incorporated into church records that documented the full scope of corruption that had been eliminated through divine intervention. The theological significance of the execution methods that had been selected for the condemned monks reflected careful consideration of doctrinal questions about the appropriate treatment of individuals whose crimes had involved not just murder and violation of corpses, but systematic blasphemy and corruption of religious institutions. The burning that awaited them was intended to serve not only as capital punishment, but as a form of purification that might offer some possibility of spiritual cleansing even as it eliminated their capacity for further evil. The atmospheric conditions that prevailed during the execution morning were interpreted by contemporary observers as signs of divine approval for proceedings that were eliminating systematic evil from Christian institutions. The clear skies and gentle breezes that facilitated the proper functioning of the pyres were seen as evidence that heavenly forces supported earthly justice, while the absence of rain or other complications was viewed as confirmation that divine will endorsed the severe measures that were being employed. Brother Lorenzo de Pisa's behaviour during his final hours revealed different psychological patterns than those displayed by Brother Giacomo, as his medical background had provided him with detailed knowledge of the physical processes that would accompany his death by burning, creating forms of anticipatory suffering that exceeded what individuals with less scientific understanding might have experienced. His apparent attempts to achieve genuine contrition were complicated by intellectual understanding of theological concepts that made simple faith difficult to achieve even in extremis. The practical arrangements that governed the simultaneous execution of multiple individuals required careful coordination to ensure that each condemned monk received appropriate spiritual attention while maintaining the ceremonial dignity that reflected the seriousness of proceedings designed to demonstrate divine justice triumphing over systematic evil. The timing and sequencing of activities were planned to maximize both the educational impact on spectators and the opportunities for final repentance among the condemned. The speeches that Brother Giacomo and his associates were permitted to deliver before their executions provided final opportunities for genuine confession and repentance, while serving as public demonstrations of the consequences that awaited individuals who chose to corrupt religious institutions for personal gratification. The content of these final statements revealed the continuing influence of theological arguments that had originally justified their criminal activities, suggesting psychological corruption that persisted even in the face of imminent divine judgment. The most disturbing aspect of these final speeches was the absence of genuine remorse for the suffering that had been inflicted on innocent victims, as the condemned monks continued to focus primarily on theological justifications and intellectual arguments, rather than expressing authentic sorrow for the human cost of their systematic evil. This psychological profile confirmed earlier assessments that their corruption exceeded normal categories of criminal behaviour, while remaining sufficiently organised to maintain sophisticated rationalizations until the final moments of their earthly existence. The ignition of the pyres that would consume the condemned monks was conducted according to ceremonial protocols that emphasized the religious significance of proceedings designed to eliminate systematic evil from Christian institutions while providing opportunities for final spiritual cleansing through physical purification. The flames that began to consume their earthly forms were interpreted by observers as visible manifestations of divine justice triumphing over corruption that had challenged the spiritual foundations of civilized society. The physical process of execution by burning provided spectators with graphic demonstrations of the consequences that awaited individuals who chose to corrupt sacred trusts while violating every principle of human dignity and Christian morality. The duration of suffering that preceded death was interpreted as divine justice, ensuring that punishment matched the magnitude of crimes that had claimed dozens of innocent lives while corrupting institutions designed to serve spiritual rather than evil purposes. The supernatural phenomena that several observers reported during the executions were interpreted as signs of divine intervention in proceedings that were eliminating systematic evil from religious institutions. The unusual behavior of the flames, the atmospheric disturbances that accompanied the deaths, and the sounds that seemed to emanate from sources beyond normal human understanding were viewed as evidence that celestial forces were participating in earthly justice while ensuring that appropriate spiritual consequences accompanied physical punishment. The disposal of remains that followed the completion of the executions was conducted according to procedures designed to prevent any form of veneration or memorialization that might transform individuals who had committed unprecedented crimes into objects of morbid curiosity or misguided sympathy. The ashes that remained after complete combustion were scattered in locations that would ensure their complete dispersal while preventing the creation of shrines or other commemorative sites. The immediate aftermath of the executions created atmospheric changes throughout the region that were interpreted by contemporary observers as signs that divine justice had successfully eliminated sources of systematic evil while restoring spiritual equilibrium to communities that had been corrupted through years of systematic deception and manipulation. The psychological relief that characterized public responses reflected recognition that unprecedented threats to innocent life and spiritual welfare had been permanently eliminated. The broader implications of these executions extended far beyond the immediate elimination of specific criminals to encompass fundamental questions about institutional accountability and the measures necessary to prevent future occurrences of systematic corruption within religious institutions. The precedents that had been established through these proceedings would influence ecclesiastical law and administrative procedures for generations to come while demonstrating the Church's commitment to eliminating evil that threatened its spiritual mission. The documentation that was prepared to record these historic executions emphasized both their significance as demonstrations of divine justice and their function as eternal warnings about the consequences that awaited individuals who might consider corrupting religious institutions for personal gratification. The detailed accounts that were preserved in church archives would serve educational purposes for future generations, while providing evidence of institutional commitment to eliminating systematic evil, regardless of the social status or intellectual sophistication of its perpetrators. As the smoke from the execution pyres dispersed into the clear Italian sky, the citizens of Florence and the broader Christian community could begin the long process of healing from trauma that had been inflicted through years of systematic deception and violation by individuals they had trusted with their spiritual welfare and physical security. Divine wrath had been demonstrated through earthly justice, and the forces of systematic evil had been eliminated through procedures that combined legal punishment with spiritual purification. The monsters had been destroyed, but their legacy would continue to influence religious institutions and legal procedures for centuries to come, serving as permanent reminders of the capacity for evil that existed within human nature, while demonstrating the ultimate triumph of divine justice over corruption that challenged the fundamental values of Christian civilization. Chapter 14. Echoes of Evil, the Aftermath. The smoke had barely cleared from the execution pyres in Florence when reports began reaching church authorities throughout Europe describing similar cases of systematic corruption within religious institutions that had previously been considered above suspicion. The revelations about the Monastery of San Benedetto had created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their communities to encompass fundamental questions about institutional accountability and the effectiveness of existing oversight mechanisms in preventing systematic evil from corrupting sacred trusts. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, whose investigation and prosecution of the Tuscan case had established him as the Church's primary expert on systematic clerical corruption, found himself appointed to head a special commission charged with examining religious institutions throughout Europe for evidence of similar criminal activities. The resources and authority that were provided for this unprecedented investigation reflected both the seriousness with which church leadership viewed the threat of systematic corruption and their recognition that the San Benedetto case might represent only the most visible example of problems that had infected religious institutions throughout Christendom. The methodological approach that Cardinal Farnese developed for these expanded investigations drew on lessons learned from the Tuscan case, while incorporating innovations designed to detect forms of systematic corruption that might be more sophisticated or better concealed than the activities that had been uncovered at San Benedetto. The investigative teams that were assembled for deployment throughout Europe included not only traditional ecclesiastical investigators but medical experts, financial analysts, and specialists in criminal behaviour who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to uncover complex criminal enterprises operating under religious cover. The first major case that emerged from these expanded investigations involved the Monastery of St. Florian in Austria, where evidence was discovered of systematic murder and corpse violation that had claimed the lives of at least 32 nuns over a period of 6 years. The organisational structure and operational methods that were documented in this case showed remarkable similarities to those that had characterised the San Benedetto operations, suggesting that criminal techniques and theological justifications had been shared between different locations through networks that had not been fully understood during the original investigation. The parallels between the Austrian and Tuscan cases extended beyond simple operational similarities to include evidence of direct communication and resource sharing between the criminal organisations that had operated in different countries. The correspondence that was discovered during searches of the St. Florian Monastery included detailed technical information about preservation techniques, poison preparation, and victim selection criteria that appear to have originated from sources connected to Brother Giacomo's organisation. The theological documents that were found in the Austrian monastery revealed systematic corruption of religious doctrine that followed patterns virtually identical to those that had been developed in Tuscany, suggesting that perverted intellectual frameworks had been deliberately propagated through networks of corrupted religious figures who were sharing both criminal techniques and rationalization strategies. The sophistication of these theological innovations indicated coordination and planning that exceeded what individual criminal groups could have achieved through independent development. The investigation of the Monastery of St. Sebald in Bavaria uncovered evidence of criminal activities that had extended beyond systematic murder and necrophilia to include trafficking in human remains on an international scale. The commercial networks that were documented through seized records revealed connections with customers throughout Central Europe who had been purchasing religious relics that were actually fragments of murdered victims, creating markets that had provided substantial financial incentives for criminal activities while corrupting legitimate religious commerce. The French investigation that examined the Abbey of St. Denis near Paris revealed perhaps the most disturbing evidence of systematic corruption, as documents were discovered indicating that criminal techniques and theological justifications had been deliberately developed and refined through collaborative research that had treated the murder and violation of innocent women as subjects for scientific study. The materials that were found suggested that corrupted religious figures had been systematically experimenting with different approaches to criminal activity while sharing their findings to improve operational effectiveness. The scope of international criminal collaboration that was revealed through these expanded investigations exceeded the worst fears of church authorities, who had hoped that the San Benedetto case represented an isolated aberration rather than evidence of systematic problems that had infected religious institutions throughout Europe. The evidence that emerged painted a picture of coordinated criminal enterprises that had operated across national boundaries while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious activity. The psychological impact of these revelations on religious communities throughout Europe created trauma that would influence attitudes toward clerical authority for generations to come. The knowledge that individuals who had been entrusted with spiritual guidance and physical protection had been systematically violating those trusts while maintaining appearances of exemplary religious devotion challenged fundamental assumptions about the reliability of institutional safeguards and the trustworthiness of religious authority. The reform measures that were implemented in response to these discoveries represented unprecedented changes in church administration and oversight procedures that reflected recognition that existing systems had proven inadequate to prevent systematic corruption within religious institutions. The new protocols that were established for monitoring monastery and convent operations included requirements for external auditing, mandatory rotation of personnel, and enhanced background investigation procedures that were designed to identify potential problems before they could develop into systematic criminal enterprises. The educational initiatives that were launched to prevent future occurrences of similar corruption included comprehensive revisions of seminary curricula that emphasized ethical training and psychological evaluation procedures designed to identify individuals whose personality characteristics might make them susceptible to corruption under the pressure of religious authority and social isolation. These educational reforms reflected recognition that intellectual sophistication alone was insufficient to prevent moral corruption, while proper psychological preparation might provide some protection against systematic evil. The legal precedents that had been established through the prosecution of the San Benedetto case influenced the development of new canonical and secular legal frameworks that were better equipped to address crimes that transcended traditional categories of criminal behavior, while involving violations of sacred trusts that demanded responses exceeding conventional punishment. The procedural innovations that had been developed for investigating and prosecuting systematic religious corruption would provide models for future cases while establishing standards that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The financial investigations that accompanied the criminal proceedings revealed the extent to which systematic corruption had been motivated and sustained by commercial considerations that had transformed religious institutions into profit-making enterprises serving criminal rather than spiritual purposes. The money laundering techniques and investment strategies that were documented through seized records demonstrated sophisticated understanding of financial management that exceeded what most legitimate businesses achieved while generating revenues through systematic violation of human dignity. The international cooperation that had been necessitated by the discovery of cross-border criminal networks established precedents for ecclesiastical and secular coordination that would prove essential for addressing other forms of systematic corruption that operated beyond the boundaries of individual jurisdictions. The information-sharing protocols and joint investigation procedures that were developed through these cases would provide frameworks for future collaborative efforts, while demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated responses to complex criminal enterprises. The theological scholarship that was produced in response to revelations about systematic corruption within religious institutions included comprehensive analyses of the intellectual frameworks that had been developed to justify unprecedented criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of orthodox religious belief. These scholarly works provide a detailed documentation of how legitimate theological traditions could be systematically corrupted to serve evil purposes, while offering insights into psychological and spiritual factors that might prevent similar corruption in future generations. The memorial services that were conducted for the victims of systematic religious corruption created opportunities for communities to begin healing from trauma that had been inflicted through years of systematic deception and violation by individuals they had trusted with their spiritual welfare and physical security. These commemorative activities emphasized both the innocence of those who'd been murdered and violated, and the courage of those who had risked their own safety to expose criminal activities that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The architectural modifications that were implemented at religious sites where systematic corruption had been discovered included not only the destruction of facilities that had been used for criminal purposes, but the construction of memorial chapels and gardens designed to honor victims while serving as permanent reminders of the vigilance necessary to prevent future occurrences of similar evil. These physical changes reflected both practical security considerations and symbolic commitments to ensuring that sacred spaces would never again be corrupted for criminal purposes. As the immediate crisis created by revelations about systematic religious corruption began to subside, church authorities and secular governments throughout Europe faced the long-term challenge of rebuilding institutional credibility while implementing reforms that could prevent future occurrences of similar problems. The echoes of evil that had been revealed through the San Benedetto investigation would continue to influence religious institutions and legal systems for generations to come, serving as permanent reminders of the capacity for corruption that existed within human nature while demonstrating the importance of eternal vigilance in protecting the innocent from those who would exploit sacred trusts for evil purposes. The aftermath was just beginning, but already it was clear that the systematic evil that had been eliminated through divine justice would leave permanent changes in its wake, transforming religious institutions and legal systems while serving as an eternal warning about the depths of corruption that could emerge when sacred trusts were betrayed by individuals whose souls had been claimed by forces that operated beyond every boundary of human decency and divine grace. Chapter 15. Legacy of Blasphemy. When Faith Becomes Horror, the final chapter in the dark saga of the Monastery of San Benedetto began not with the execution of its corrupted monks, but with the profound and lasting changes that their crimes would inflict upon the very fabric of European religious life for centuries to come. As the year 1479 dawned over a continent still reeling from revelations that had shaken the foundations of Christian civilization, the legacy of systematic evil that had been perpetrated under the cover of sacred vows was already transforming institutions, laws, and the collective consciousness of believers who could no longer take for granted the sanctity of those entrusted with their spiritual welfare. The immediate reforms that swept through religious institutions across Europe in the wake of the San Benedetto revelations represented the most comprehensive restructuring of monastic and convent life since the great reforms of the 11th century. Pope Sixtus IV, whose papacy had been profoundly shaken by discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about clerical integrity, issued a series of bulls that established new protocols for monastery and convent administration, designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished under inadequate oversight and misplaced trust. The most significant of these papal reforms required the establishment of external oversight committees composed of lay people and secular clergy who would conduct regular inspections of religious communities while maintaining independent authority to investigate suspicious activities and report directly to Rome rather than through local ecclesiastical hierarchies that might be compromised by corruption or personal relationships. These oversight mechanisms represented unprecedented intrusions into religious autonomy that reflected recognition that traditional self-governance had proven inadequate to prevent systematic evil. The psychological screening procedures that were implemented for individuals seeking admission to religious communities represented another revolutionary change that acknowledged the role of individual pathology in enabling systematic corruption. The evaluation protocols that were developed drew on emerging understanding of human psychology while incorporating theological assessments designed to identify potential problems before they could develop into systematic criminal behavior under the pressure of religious authority and social isolation. The architectural modifications that were mandated for existing religious communities included requirements for improved visibility, elimination of hidden spaces that could facilitate clandestine activities, and installation of communication systems that would ensure that isolated incidents could not escalate into systematic problems without detection. These physical changes reflected recognition that environmental factors had contributed to enabling criminal activities by providing opportunities for concealment that had allowed systematic evil to flourish undetected. The theological education that was revolutionized in response to revelations about the intellectual sophistication of systematic corruption included enhanced emphasis on moral reasoning, psychological awareness, and practical ethics designed to prepare future religious leaders for the kinds of moral challenges that previous generations had not anticipated. The curriculum reforms that were implemented reflected understanding that intellectual capability alone was insufficient to prevent corruption, while proper moral formation might provide some protection against systematic evil. The legal precedents that had been established through the prosecution of the San Benedetto case influenced the development of new canonical and secular legal frameworks throughout Europe that were better equipped to address crimes involving religious authority while providing enhanced protection for victims who might be vulnerable to exploitation by individuals who occupied positions of trust. The procedural innovations that had been developed for investigating systematic religious corruption would provide models for future prosecutions while establishing standards that would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. The cultural impact of the San Benedetto revelations extended far beyond legal and institutional changes to encompass fundamental shifts in popular attitudes toward religious authority and clerical integrity. The literature, art, and folklore that emerged in response to these discoveries reflected deep-seated anxiety about the reliability of institutional protection while expressing collective trauma that would influence European culture for generations to come. The artistic representations of the San Benedetto case that appeared throughout Europe during the late 15th and early 16th centuries revealed the profound psychological impact that revelations about systematic religious corruption had inflicted upon collective consciousness. The paintings, sculptures, and literary works that depicted various aspects of the case served both educational and cathartic functions, while demonstrating the lasting influence that these events would have on European cultural development. Dante's Inferno provided a literary framework that many contemporary observers used to understand and categorize the evil that had been revealed through the San Benedetto investigation, with several prominent theologians arguing that the crimes that had been documented exceeded anything that the great poet had imagined in his vision of hell. The theological discussions that emerged from attempts to place these crimes within traditional frameworks of Christian understanding revealed the inadequacy of existing moral categories to encompass systematic evil that transcended conventional understanding of human depravity. The international cooperation that had been necessitated by discoveries of cross-border criminal networks established precedents for ecclesiastical and secular coordination that would prove essential for addressing other forms of systematic corruption while demonstrating the effectiveness of collaborative responses to complex criminal enterprises. The information sharing protocols and joint investigation procedures that were developed through these cases would provide frameworks for future international law enforcement efforts. The economic impact of systematic religious corruption extended beyond the immediate costs of investigation and prosecution to encompass broader effects on religious commerce and institutional financing that reflected changed attitudes toward the reliability of religious institutions. The decline in donations and bequests that characterized the immediate aftermath of the revelations created financial pressure that forced additional reforms while demonstrating the practical consequences of lost public trust. The memorial traditions that developed around the victims of systematic religious corruption created new forms of devotional practice that emphasized both the innocence of those who had been murdered and the courage of those who had exposed criminal activities despite personal risk. These commemorative practices served therapeutic functions for traumatized communities while establishing precedents for honoring victims of institutional betrayal that would influence religious practice for centuries. The scholarly research that was produced in response to the San Benedetto case included comprehensive analyses of the social, psychological, and institutional factors that had enabled systematic corruption while providing recommendations for preventing similar problems in future generations. The academic literature that emerged from these studies would influence theological education, administrative practice, and legal development, while serving as permanent documentation of lessons learned through tragic experience. The haunting legends that grew up around the Monastery of San Benedetto and its corrupted inhabitants reflected the psychological need to process trauma that exceeded normal human capacity for understanding, while creating cautionary tales that would influence popular culture throughout Europe. The ghost stories, folk ballads, and oral traditions that emerged from these events served educational functions while providing communities with ways to discuss and remember traumatic experiences that might otherwise have been suppressed. The architectural preservation efforts that were undertaken at sites connected to systematic religious corruption reflected competing impulses to eliminate painful reminders while maintaining educational resources that could serve future generations. The decisions that were made about which structures to preserve, modify, or destroy revealed complex attitudes toward historical trauma while establishing precedents for dealing with physical legacies of systematic evil. The ongoing investigations that continued throughout the late 15th century revealed additional cases of systematic religious corruption that demonstrated the scope of problems that had infected European religious institutions while validating concerns that had motivated comprehensive reform efforts. The criminal networks that were uncovered through these expanded investigations exceeded the worst fears of those who had hoped that the San Benedetto case represented an isolated aberration rather than evidence of widespread institutional failure. The therapeutic approaches that were developed for communities that had been traumatized by revelations about systematic religious corruption represented early recognition of collective psychological trauma, while establishing precedents for institutional responses to betrayal of trust that would influence social work and community healing practices for centuries. The counseling programs and support systems that were implemented reflected understanding that healing required both individual and collective approaches to processing traumatic experiences. As the 16th century began and the immediate crisis created by the San Benedetto revelations gradually receded into historical memory, the lasting changes that had been implemented in response to systematic religious corruption continued to influence European religious life, while serving as permanent reminders of the vigilance necessary to protect the innocent from exploitation by those who would corrupt sacred trusts for evil purposes. The legacy of blasphemy that had emerged from the depths of human corruption would continue to influence religious institutions, legal systems, and popular culture for centuries to come, serving as an eternal warning about the capacity for evil that existed within human nature while demonstrating the ultimate triumph of divine justice over forces that challenged the fundamental values of Christian civilization. The faith had been tested by horror, but it had emerged stronger through trials that had eliminated systematic evil, while establishing safeguards that would protect future generations from similar corruption. The monsters were gone, but their memory would live forever as a reminder that even the most sacred institutions remained vulnerable to corruption when eternal vigilance was abandoned in favor of misplaced trust in human nature. The price of protecting innocence was constant watchfulness, and the legacy of the Monastery of San Benedetto would ensure that this lesson was never forgotten by those who inherited the responsibility of safeguarding the sacred trusts that made civilized society possible. The darkness had been exposed to the light of divine justice, and though the scars would remain forever, the triumph of good over evil had been demonstrated through proceedings that would influence human civilization for as long as memory endured. Sleep well, knowing that even the deepest evil cannot ultimately triumph over forces that operate in service to justice, truth, and the protection of innocent life. Thank you for joining the Bedside Historian on this dark journey through one of history's most disturbing cases of institutional corruption. Subscribe for more stories from the shadows of the past, where we explore the monsters that hide behind sacred masks and the heroes who dare to expose them to the light of justice.